Woo boy. Got the window open. Nice day. You may hear some dogs. You may hear a cat tearing up the house. It's a beautiful day. A good day for getting it on with aliens. If you're into that, maybe a ghost, something else. I don't know. Whatever your particular flavor is, we're going to get into it. In the finale, mostly, sort of human, non-human entity sexual encounters. You may hear some cars also. Roll with it. How do you do, you beautiful cukes? I cannot talk right today. That's going to be a problem. How do you do, you beautiful kooks? That's what I meant to say. Welcome to this episode, Kooks, Cranks, and Iconoclasts. I'm your host, Mike Lucht, and today, yes, as I mentioned, is the final chapter, sort of, kind of, for the human, non-human sexual encounters series. This is such a vast topic that it's something that we'll return to in various means and ways going down the line. There's just so much that falls under this umbrella, this topic. My Saturnian Lover. That's a book someone wrote. Nonfiction. Oh, there's just tons of it. You go back to the contactee era of the 50s and 60s, before everything turned into abductions. Man, there is a lot of strange literature. So much stuff about the whole contacting aliens through Ouija boards type stuff, and quote unquote spirit guides, etc. But yeah, it's a wellspring. It's a one could say a plethora. So yeah, before we get into that, real quick, let's hear a word or several from our sponsors. You know, after a night that encapsulates entire light years of making sweet, sweet love, my alien girlfriend, she's from Canada, you don't know her, you work up a mighty thirst. You might have a couple drinks, probably helps depending on what your alien lover looks like. Maybe you need to be goggling a little bit. You're going to be hungover the next day. Or are you? Fear not, because now there is a special invention created to help prevent hangovers. It's called Liqueur Gummies. Liquure. Liqueur. It's the cure for liquor. Liqueur Gummies combines DHM, milk thistle, B vitamins, and ginger root to help your body recover after drinking. They fight fatigue, nausea, and dehydration, so you wake up feeling refreshed. Try them for faster recovery and enjoy an exclusive discount with my promo code ICON, ICON, at liqueur.com, liquure.com, for 20% off any product exclusively through Kooks, Cranks, and Iconoclast, the podcast. Tell them Mike sent you, and they'll say, who? Haha, yes, 20% off any product, total cart purchase. So says the literature. Check them out. They work. Brilliant. So yeah, that alien lover I mentioned didn't work out so well. And now her alien brothers are stalking me. Turned into a whole thing. Very much under a lot of stress. And I need something to help me calm down. Luckily for that, there's Shimmerwood Beverages. Shimmerwood's award-winning CBD seltzers combine full-spectrum CBD and natural fruit shrubs, delivering a refreshing, stress-relieving drink that eases tension and promotes relaxation. Enjoy an exclusive discount with my promo code ICON, ICON, at shimmerwood.com for 30% off any product exclusively through Kooks, Cranks, and Iconoclast, the podcast. Also on this one, you can tell them Mike sent you, and they'll have no idea who you are talking about. Let's go back to the show. Brilliant! It's weird how some of these companies, they just, man, anybody can start a podcast. And there's these services out there, and anyone can get get the deputization, I guess, for becoming one of their spokespeople. I don't know. Yeah. Well, at least I make the ads honest. Except for the alien girlfriend part. I lied about that. Moving on. Let's get into my script. So when we last left off, I think we covered more of the Eastern religious view of these encounters. And this is where we kind of got into, but didn't really fully cover, the idea of esoteric anatomy. So across cultures that never spoke to each other, the same idea keeps showing up. The human body is not merely biological, but operational. It's not just something one inhabits, but something one runs. So Tantra, Neidan, Taoist alchemy, traditional Chinese medicine, and Western esotericism all converge on one point: that the body is a structured system of flows, pressures, reservoirs, gates, and circuits through which something more fundamental than flesh is routed. You can call it spirit, consciousness, energy, life force, chi, ki, cheeky monkey, whatever you want to call it. The vocabulary changes, but the essence remains consistent. So in these systems, anatomy is not descriptive, it's instrumental. Organs are not valued for survival alone, but for their role in transformation. Breath is not respiration, it's modulation. Sexuality is not recreation. Well, it is, but it can be. It's also leverage. The nervous system, long before it was mapped electrically, was understood to be a subtle wiring harness for various states of awareness. So what modern biology would later call hormones, neurotransmitters, and electromagnetic signals were all once described as things like essences, winds, vapors, and fires. Not poetically, but functionally. So tantric traditions describe chakras, channels, and bindus, not as metaphors, but as interfaces between gross matter and subtler states of being. Neidan, Taoist alchemy, maps the body into furnaces, cauldrons, and fields, treating organs as alchemical stages through which an embryonic secondary self is refined. Traditional Chinese medicine speaks of various meridians and qi not as abstractions, but as circulation systems whose blockages result in both physical illness and psychic disturbances. Western esotericism mirrors this with its various planetary organs, etheric doubles, astral bodies, and magnetic fluids. Despite differences in cosmology, all of these systems agree on several somewhat unsettling points. That life force is real, mobile, and accumulative. That consciousness can be altered by manipulating bodily flows, and that sexuality is the most efficient and dangerous access point to this system. It's not mysticism as a belief, it's mysticism as engineering. So within these frameworks, sex ceases to be about pleasure or reproduction and becomes something else entirely. It's like a pressure valve, a pump, or a gateway. Tantra formalizes this explicitly, treating sexual arousal as a means of forcing energy upward and inward rather than outward. Word? Nadon similarly warns against loss of essence, framing ejaculation as not a moral failure, but as a catastrophic energy leakage. So even in Western esotericism, from Renaissance magic through 19th century magnetism, animal magnetism, Franz Antoine Mesmer, I believe, that guy and his teachings, sexual force is treated as a volatile current capable of animating symbols, spirits, and artificial beings. And what matters is not the act, but the directionality, the intention behind it. Energy retained, circulated, transmuted. Energy lost, dispersed, depleted. But these traditions are less concerned with ethics than with entropy. Sex isn't dangerous, not because it's sinful, but because it is powerful. And power, misapplied, can destabilize systems. So already you feel the ground shifting a bit. This is not spirituality versus science. This is pre-scientific physiology, whose language we've only recently begun to translate as far as things like consciousness exploration, biophysical life force and energies, etc. So when you stack these systems together, a strange picture forms. The human body is treated as a relay station between earth and sky, matter and mind, individual and collective, self, other, etc. Subtle anatomy doesn't end at the skin. The flows extend outward, interacting with environments, atmospheres, and possibly even intelligences that are not human at all. And this is why so many traditions insist that altered states, ritual postures, breath work, and sexual discipline, not that kind. Two. Okay, both. Why not? It can be both things. Open perception beyond the ordinary. These aren't visions, they're changes in frequency or bandwidth. So by this point, it kind of becomes a little clearer that what later eras would call contact or encounter has already existed within these models, not as an invasion, but as a coupling. The human nervous system, when tuned correctly, can become accessible to forces that do not speak language but respond to a resonance. So this means that by the time the story turns toward figures who explicitly blur magic and science, or ritual with experiment, or sex with propulsion, for example, that by the time we reach the fulcrum of this episode, the question will no longer be whether humans can contact non-human intelligences. The question is whether we have been building our own piece by piece, ritual by ritual, long before we ever tried to leave the planet. Are we creating these entities? At the moment, when occult anatomy sheds its mythic skin and steps into laboratories, machines, and measurement, that's when a certain Wilhelm Reich enters the story. Because Reich didn't invent a new idea. He took an ancient one and asked a question no mystic ever dared to ask out loud. What if this force is measurable, physical? And what if it doesn't give a shit about us at all? It has no morality to it in itself. Wilhelm Reich didn't emerge from mysticism or occult lodges. He emerged from collapse. He was trained as a physician and psychoanalyst under Freud, and Reich came of age amid the psychic wreckage of post-World War I Europe, where sexual repression, political extremism, and mass psychosis were no longer abstractions, but very much a lived reality. So for Reich, the body was not a symbol, it was a battlefield on which ideology, trauma, and power could be written. And his earliest work was not about spirituality at all, but about how repression of sexual freedom produced authoritarian personalities, emotional stagnancy, and populations primed for fascism. Yeah. Reich's break with Freud was rooted in this conviction that sexuality was not merely psychological, but biological and energetic, and that suppressing it produced measurable, catastrophic consequences. Where Freud stopped at interpretation, Reich pushed towards a mechanical system, so to speak. He wanted to know how repression manifested itself in muscle, breath, posture, and nervous system. And this led him to his concept of character armor, which is the idea that the body literally hardens against forbidden impulse. I'm a grown man. Stop it. Okay. A notion that already places Reich squarely within the lineage of occult physiology, whether he acknowledged it or not. Reich's thinking cannot be separated from the rise of Nazi Germany, because the Nazis were engaged in their own grotesque, mythologized struggle over biology, sexuality, and inheritance. While Reich argued that repression created fascism, the Nazi regime inverted the logic, claiming that biological purity and mythical lineage justified repression. And their pseudoscientific obsessions like theozoology or serpent seed myths, because they're older than I thought, unfortunately, blood mysticism, and fantasies of ancestral soul capture through child conception in the graveyards of Nordic warriors. This is real shit. Fucking kooky. These were not fringe curiosities, but they were using them as ideological tools. So sex for the Nazis was not about pleasure. It was a weaponization of lineage, we'll say. And this is crucial because Reich was not flirting with these ideas. He was fighting them. But the battlefield was the same. Both Reich and the Nazis believed sexuality shaped civilization at a fundamental level. Where Reich saw repression as poison, the Nazis saw it as discipline.
Werewolf women of the SS.
Where Reich emphasized vitality and flow, they emphasized bloodline and soil. And the horrible irony is that both sides frame sex not as private behavior, but as a civilizational technology of sorts. Reich fled Nazi persecution precisely because his ideas threatened their mythic control of the body. His books were burned, his clinics dismantled, his name erased, and yet the questions he raised did not disappear. Exile radicalized Reich's thinking. So if repression could shape politics and sexuality could shape consciousness, then something deeper had to be operating beneath psychology itself. Reich began to suspect that libido was not merely a drive, but an expression of a more fundamental life force, one that animated cells, emotions, atmospheres, perhaps even the cosmos. And this is where Reich's work makes its decisive turn from psychoanalysis into things far stranger. He called this force orgone. Reich did not invent the idea of a universal life energy, but he modernized it. Orgone sits unmistakably in the same lineage as prana, ki, or chi, the pneuma, odic force, and animal magnetism. What made Reich dangerous was not the concept itself, but his insistence that it could be measured, accumulated, and manipulated. He built devices. He conducted experiments. He claimed physiological effects. And in doing so, he dragged esoteric physiology out of the temples and out of the lodges and into the laboratory at precisely the historical moment when science itself was learning to split atoms and weaponize invisible forces. This is why Reich belongs among the sex magicians, even if he would have rejected the term. Like Pascal Beverly Randolph, Ida Craddock, and even Crowley, to a lesser extent, Reich treated sexuality as a primary interface. But unlike those others, he stripped it of ritual language and framed it in medical terms. Orgasms, for Reich, were not a mystical union, but an energetic discharge. Blocked discharge could lead to neurosis. Chronic blockage led to authoritarianism. Civilizations rose and fell based on how they handled this flow. Where earlier occult systems mapped chakras and meridians, Reich mapped muscular tension and breath. Where Tantra circulated energy upward, Reich focused on restoring its natural fluctuations. Different diagrams, same machine. And crucially, Reich extended this logic beyond the body. If orgone permeated living tissue, why not clouds? Why not space? Why not unidentified aerial phenomenon? By the time Reich was writing about UFOs, atmospheric energy, and what he believed were hostile orgone-depleted systems, he'd fully crossed into the territory where occult anatomy becomes cosmic ecology. He stands at the exact threshold this has all been building towards, this moment when ancient models of life force collide with modern power structures. His persecution by the U.S. government, the destruction of his equipment, and his death in prison are not evidence that he was quote-unquote right, but they are evidence that he was intolerable. He refused to keep sex private, energy symbolic, or science obedient. By the time Reich enters this whole conversation, this is what he represents essentially. He's not a crank, not a prophet, but a warning. The man who tried to translate esoteric anatomy into a language for the atomic age and discovered that some ideas are more dangerous when you stop calling them myths. His concept of orgone did not emerge suddenly, nor was it meant to be mystical. In his works, such as The Function of Orgasm, 1942, and later The Cancer Biopathy, 1948, Reich describes orgone as a primordial, mass-free energy observable in living organisms, as well as the atmosphere and space itself. He claimed it was responsible for pulsation, growth, emotion, weather, and sexual vitality, not as symbolic correlations, but as literal energetic phenomena. Orgone accumulated in systems that were open, rhythmic, and alive. It stagnated or inverted in systems that were rigid, armored, or repressed. So Reich believed orgone behaved differently from electromagnetic energy. It was attracted to living tissue. It radiated softly. It formed blue-gray luminescent patterns in darkened environments, and strangest of all, it appeared to respond to emotional states, especially fear, arousal, and repression. Ghostbusters 2, I'm looking at you. Slime, baby. This is one reason alone that places orgone squarely within the same conceptual family as the aforementioned chi, animal magnetism, odic force, etc., but Reich's refusal to keep it symbolic is what escalated everything. His most famous invention, the orgone accumulator, was essentially a layered box made of alternating organic and metallic materials, designed to concentrate ambient orgone energy. Patients would sit inside of it for short periods, and Reich claimed measurable effects, such as increased body temperature, heightened sensation, emotional release, and in some cases, dramatic psychological breakthroughs.
Oh God, what a breakthrough!
These accounts are recorded in Reich's own writings and corroborated, cautiously, by several contemporaries, though mainstream medicine rejected the findings outright. What's often overlooked is how intimate these effects were described. People reported heightened sexual feelings, emotional flooding, vivid dreams, and a sense of being, quote-unquote, opened or, quote-unquote, plugged into something vast and impersonal. Reich warned repeatedly that orgone exposure without proper grounding could produce anxiety, paranoia, you're being penoid, man, and disassociation. In Character Analysis, one of his books, he stresses that contact with unmediated life energy could be destabilizing, especially for armored personalities. Already, this resembles later abduction narratives. There's physiological effects, altered states, emotional overwhelm, encounters that feel invasive, not because they're violent, but because they bypass consent at the level of self-regulation. If orgone was Reich's life force, then Melanor was its shadow. In his book, The Oriner Experiment, 1951, Reich describes exposing concentrated orgone to radioactive material. The result, he claimed, was catastrophic. Orgone didn't neutralize radiation, it became sickened by it. Reich described the emergence of a deadly, stagnant, toxic energy that he called deadly orgone radiation, or DOR, accompanied by symptoms in humans and animals such as nausea, burns, emotional collapse, paranoia, and ecological disturbances. Melanor, a related substance Reich claimed to have observed, was described as a blackened, degraded residue formed when orgone collapsed into entropy. So in Reich's framework, this wasn't evil, it was an ecological imbalance. Life energy deprived of circulation, rhythm, and discharge. Just a quick note, it's also worth noting, and we'll only touch on this briefly for now, that some contemporary research and fringe theories have begun circulating back towards ideas that feel very closely Reichian. Studies and hypotheses around plasma as the fourth state of matter, its presence in neurological microenvironments, and speculative models of plasma-based consciousness suggest that cognition itself may not be strictly chemical or electrical, but partially organized through ionized, self-structuring energetic systems. So in other words, the brain may already host conditions where something like orgone, prana, or chi would feel right at home, not as a metaphor, but as a process. This also opens the door to a cluster of modern myths and anomalies surrounding the so-called black goo, smart fluids, self-organizing materials, and sentient plasmas. A whole constellation of ideas that reoccur in pop culture, as well as UFO encounters, classified adjacent rumor with suspicious consistency. We'll be devoting an entire future episode to that terrain, but for now, it's enough to flag the possibility that Reich's intuition that life, mind, and environment share a subtle energetic undertone, which may not be buried in the past so much as waiting for a new vocabulary to capture it, essentially. And this is where Reich's work becomes very relevant to ufology. He'd inadvertently built a model where advanced technology poisons the energetic foundations of reality itself. So by the early 1950s, Reich began reporting encounters with unidentified aerial phenomena. In his book, Contact with Space, 1957, written shortly before his imprisonment, Reich documents luminous disks, silent maneuvering objects, and atmospheric disturbances observed near his research sites. Importantly, he did not interpret these as extraterrestrial visitors in the conventional sense. He believed that they were energy-regulating systems, possibly autonomous, possibly even conscious, sentient, responding to disturbances in the orgone field caused by nuclear testing and industrial activity. His most controversial claim was that these objects appeared to drain orgone energy from the environment, leaving behind regions of DOR, deadly orgone radiation, as well as melanor, the black goo. He interpreted this not as an invasion, but as a kind of hostile ecological intervention, a response to humanity's reckless disruption of planetary energy balance. And this reframes UFOs not as explorers or gods, but as custodial intelligences.
Custodian, dick.
Uninterested in humanity, except insofar as humanity damages the medium they require. Why all the stories of abductions and contactees constantly saying that the aliens are admonishing us for damaging the environment? Probably a couple reasons, but this once again puts a whole new light on the frequency of those particular narratives from these non-human entities. Several associates of Reich later described the atmosphere surrounding these encounters as deeply unsettling. In accounts preserved by Reich students and biographers, including one Myron Sharaf in a book called Fury on Earth, observers described sudden emotional flattening, insomnia, dread, and a sense of being quote-unquote watched. Not personally, but systematically, as if the environment had eyes. Reich himself reported fluctuations between awe and terror, convinced that whatever these phenomena were, they did not care about human meaning, belief, or survival. One recurring theme in these accounts is non-communication. There were no messages, no revelations, no moral instructions, only presence, reaction, withdrawal. This aligns disturbingly well with later reports of intimate non-human encounters that are sexual, medical, or psychological that feel purposeful but are never given a full explanation. Reich warned repeatedly that attempting to engage these forces emotionally or symbolically was a mistake. They weren't spirits, they weren't demons, they weren't allies. They were part of an energetic ecosystem that humans had only recently begun to disturb. So if orgone is drawn to arousal, emotion, and biological vitality, and if advanced non-human systems interact with orgone, then sexuality becomes an attractor state. Not because it's pleasurable, but because it's energetically dense, putting out a lot of heat, a lot of BTUs and whatnot. It doubles as a method of energy transmission. Reich never described sexual contact with non-human entities, but his framework makes such encounters not only plausible, but predictable. Intense biological charge draws a good deal of attention. This provides ufology with something it desperately lacks, a non-mythological explanation for why sexual encounters recur without romance, reproduction, or pleasure. So sex in that frame is not communion, it's just access. And one of the earliest places Reich's framework begins to surface indirectly in the ufological literature is in reports of what experiencers describe not as terror, but as a sort of energetic collapse. In The Interrupted Journey, 1966, John G. Fuller recounts Betty and Barney Hill's descriptions of overwhelming weakness, paralysis, and emotional flattening during and after their encounters, sensations that lingered well beyond the event itself. While Fuller does not invoke Reich, later commentators have noted that these symptoms map uncannily well onto Reich's description of acute orgone depletion, a loss of vitality, a diminished affect, disrupted sleep, and a sense of internal hollowness, almost as if they'd been subjected to vampirism of some kind. Blah! Several abductees interviewed in later works, including Bud Hopkins' Intruders, 1987, report feeling drained, emptied, or quote-unquote left cold following their encounters, often describing it as something distinct from fear or shock. Within the Reichian frame, these experiences resemble contact with a DOR-dominant environment. Not an attack, but a sudden imbalance between the organism and its energetic surroundings. It has led to some researchers speculating that certain accounts may function less like confrontations and more like energy siphoning events, where the human nervous system is unable to maintain its usual fluctuations and rhythms. The notion of orgone vampires doesn't appear in Reich's own writings as a class of beings, but it emerges repeatedly in later speculative ufology influenced by his ideas. In Jacques Vallée's Dimensions, 1988, and Passport to Magonia, 1969, witnesses recount encounters followed by exhaustion, confusion, or long-term psychological disturbance.
Hey, shut that fucking dog up, man. I'm not
Vallée himself avoids Reichian terminology, but his insistence that these phenomena behave like control systems rather than visitors dovetails closely with Reich's ecological interpretation of these energy imbalances. Some experiencers explicitly frame their encounters in parasitic terms. In The Omega Project, 1995, Kenneth Ring documents cases where individuals report heightened sensitivity, creativity, and emotional openness following contact, alongside increased vulnerability, anxiety, and difficulty maintaining boundaries. Reich may have recognized this pattern immediately. An organism rendered more permeable, more energetically active, but less armored, and therefore exposed to both vitality and collapse. The vampire, quote unquote, framing here is not about predation in a moral sense, but about pressure differentials between systems of unequal energetic stability. Perhaps the most uncomfortable application of Reich's ideas appears in literature dealing with sexualized encounters. In Communion, 1987, later made into a film, 1989, starring a coked-up Christopher Walken.
This is gonna be so terrible. Another day down the toilet.
Big dark eyes, like a... No, more like an insect. Long face, thin, not human. I don't recall them being human.
4 or 5 feet, like big, thick kids.
Here I am, I'm naked. I'm naked. I'm talking to you like you were real. Go to hell.
Now give me a kiss. Something wrong with you?
I told you, don't touch my stuff. I shall return. I am the dreamer. You are the dream. Get up! I'm cooking. Boom! Kill it! Going for a pack of cigarettes. Broken my mind. I don't think I like this.
Some have speculated that the movie was very, very ridiculous on purpose. Whitley Strieber describes episodes marked by involuntary arousal, terror, intimacy, and eventual revulsion. Experiences that seem designed to overload emotional and psychological systems simultaneously. So while Strieber interprets these events through multiple lenses over time, Reich's model offers a chillingly simple explanation. Sexual arousal without discharge creates extreme energetic turbulence. Reich warned repeatedly that arousal divorced from release, especially under conditions of fear, produces neurosis, fixation, and long-term discombobulation of your systems. Some ufologists influenced by Reich have suggested that such encounters may not be about reproduction or pleasure at all, but about energetic harvesting or modulation, with sexuality serving as the most efficient means of amplifying orgone flow. So in this reading, the aftermath, shame, confusion, disassociation, is not incidental damage, but the predictable consequences of forcing a living system into fluctuating extremes that it can't resolve on its own. In several lesser-known cases collected by psychiatrist Berthold Schwartz and later summarized in UFO Dynamics, 1983, experiencers describe encounters in which no physical contact occurs at all, yet the body responds as if something essential has been removed. Subjects report sudden inability to breathe, chest constriction, a cold spreading sensation through the torso, and an overwhelming urge to take the fetal position, curl inward, as if conserving what little vitality remains. One witness described the sensation as, quote, having my breath borrowed and not returned, unquote. From a Reichian perspective, this maps disturbingly well onto acute orgone withdrawal, a collapse of the body's natural pulsation with visible trauma, leaving behind panic without fear and exhaustion without exertion. In Passport to Magonia, Jacques Vallée recounts several obscure European encounters in which witnesses report the entire environments seem to lose vitality following a close encounter. Plants wilting, animals refusing to enter certain areas, people experiencing nausea or emotional flatness upon return. One French case describes a farmhouse kitchen where milk spoiled instantly and insects vanished for days. Bearing in mind also that milk spoilage has a long history in various elf and fairy encounters, as well as being synonymous with witchcraft, Reich would have recognized this immediately as a DOR field, an environment rendered energetically inert, not poisoned, but emptied. The terror here is subtle. Nothing is destroyed, yet nothing thrives. Space itself feels uninterested in sustaining life. An especially unsettling subset of encounters appears in obscure hypnosis transcripts referenced in Edith Fior's Encounters, 1989, where subjects described involuntary sexual arousal paired with emotional detachment or even disgust.
Ugh. Brother, ugh.
The arousal is described as mechanical, localized, and strangely impersonal. Quote, like a reflex being tested, unquote. Several subjects report feeling less human afterwards, as if intimacy had been replaced by function. In Reichian terms, this resembles forced arousal without emotional circulation. The precise condition Reich warned would produce long-term disassociation. The horror here is not violation, it's mechanization, being reduced to a thing.
The horror. The horror.
In a cluster of obscure sightings cataloged by researcher John Keel in The Eighth Tower, 1975, witnesses report physical illness simply from prolonged visual contact with luminous or structured aerial phenomena. Symptoms include headaches, vertigo, emotional numbness, and sudden depression lasting days or weeks. Keel speculated about electromagnetic effects, but Reich's framework suggests something more intimate: energetic resonance triggered by perception itself. If orgone responds to attention and emotional arousal, then observation becomes participation, and participation carries a cost. Seeing it in this sense, it's not passive. It's an exchange. Taken individually, none of these accounts prove Reich right. Taken together, they reveal something more unsettling, that Reich's language keeps appearing because it fits the phenomena. Orgone, DOR, melanor, depletion, arousal, collapse. These concepts describe how encounters feel, not what they mean. They remove the intent, they remove the mythology, and they leave behind the interaction, which is why Reich still matters to ufology. Modern ufology fluctuates between two poles: literal spacecraft and spiritual revelation. Reich offers a third option, one that's colder, more frightening, and far more compatible with the data. UFOs are not visitors, they are responses. Not interested in us, but in the conditions we create. They interact with consciousness and biology, not out of curiosity, but because those systems fluctuate the same energetic foundations. Reich gives us language where none previously existed: DOR instead of demons, orgone depletion instead of possession, energetic imbalance instead of a moral failure. In doing so, he strips the phenomena of narrative comfort. Wilhelm Reich is somewhat terrifying, not because he believed in something strange, but because he believed in something impersonal. He removes the intent, he removes morality. He even removes the need for beings at all. So in Reich's universe, there are no demons seducing humanity, no aliens feeding on us, no intelligences making plans. There are only energetic conditions and organisms caught in the crossfire.
Crossfire, you get caught up in the crossfire. Crossfire.
What Reich proposes isn't a cosmology of agents or agency, but a cosmology of pressure. Reich's concept of orgone is often dismissed because it's described as quote-unquote sexual energy. But that framing misses its real function. Orgone behaves less like a substance and more like atmospheric pressure. It accumulates, stagnates, flows, or collapses depending on environmental conditions. Sexuality is not the source, it's one of the most visible indicators. Where orgone accumulates freely, organisms self-regulate. Where it becomes trapped, distorted, or compressed, pathology emerges. So in this sense, orgasm isn't about pleasure, it's ventilation. Reich's most radical claim is that repression doesn't merely harm individuals, it alters the energetic climate. Cultures that suppress sexuality do not eliminate desire, they compress it. Fear, shame, and moral panic act like cold fronts, forcing orgone into unstable formations. The result is not moral order, but turbulence, anxiety storms, violent discharges, sudden collective breakdowns. Repression doesn't kill energy, it condenses it. So in this framework, the vampire, quote unquote, ceases to be a being and becomes a function. A sex vampire is not an entity that feeds, it's a pressure differential. Where orgone is scarce or blocked, systems emerge that siphon it from elsewhere. These systems can be people, institutions, ideologies, or rituals. They don't need awareness or malice. Like a vacuum, they pull just because that's just what they do. Their very nature. The predator does not choose, it just forms. This is where the ecology becomes somewhat chilling. Repressed environments generate gradients, zones of high tension adjacent to zones of release. These gradients are hungry, not metaphorically, but functionally. They attract attention, fixation, obsession. Pornography, moral crusades, purity movements, and transgressive subcultures all bloom along these fault lines, not because anyone planned them, but because energy seeks release. The more violently a culture represses sexuality, the more nutritionally dense its psychic emissions become. And here's the inversion that breaks most of polite society's internal model. In Reich's universe, sexuality does not attract predators, it creates them. Not through sin or corruption, but through imbalance. When desire cannot circulate, it condenses. When it condenses, it becomes edible. And whenever something becomes edible, systems arise to eat it. No demons required, no alien agenda needed, but gray alien orgone vampires sure does make for a fucked up model. This is pure cosmic horror because there's no antagonist to defeat. You can't exercise, in the demonological sense, a weather pattern. You can't negotiate with pressure. The terror is structural. Civilization itself becomes a machine that generates its own predators by mishandling its internal climate. Moral panics, surveillance states, ritual abuse scandals, and obsessional control over bodies are not conspiracies, but symptoms of atmospheric instability. Reich doesn't predict invasion, he predicts ecological collapse. Not of forests or oceans, but of libido itself. So when arousal, fear, and repression lose equilibrium, life becomes unsustainable. Systems cannibalize their own emotional output, and societies feed on anxiety because it's the only energy left in circulation. So in such a universe, the most dangerous thing you can do isn't summoning a monster, it's to build a culture that traps desire. Suddenly, grays don't need to feed. Incubi don't need intent. Hybrids don't need lineage. The Collins elite doesn't need to be right or wrong. We'll get more into the Collins elite a little down the road. All that's required is an ecosystem where repression outpaces release. So in this sense, the quote-unquote vampires aren't gifted with agency, essentially. They're just part of the system. It's part of the process. Reich's ultimate contribution isn't that he explained UFOs, but that he removed intent from the equation. No salvation, No invasion, no destiny, just systems reacting to systems. By the time we move forward from Reich, we become a bit unmoored, but also equipped. We now have a model we can hold. Sexual contact without desire, observation without communication, intervention without interest, intimacy without empathy. It's exactly the vehicle we'll need for the bumpy roads ahead.
Roads.
While Aleister Crowley hardly needs introduction, it's imperative that we examine a specific subset of his work before moving forward. Not because Crowley is the center of this story, but because several of the ideas and ritual frameworks that will dominate the fulcrum of this episode pass directly through him. Crowley occupies a strange position in the lineage we've been tracing. He systemized earlier Western sex magic traditions, absorbed Eastern concepts through a very modern lens, and probably unintentionally helped formalize a model of contact that would later be reframed in extraterrestrial terms. Two works in particular demand attention here: the Ultra Working and the Moonchild. Between 1918 and 1921, Crowley undertook a series of ritual experiments now collectively referred to as the Ultra Working, conducted primarily in New York with various collaborators. Unlike Crowley's earlier magical operations, which were often explicitly framed around angels, gods, or symbolic initiations, the Ultra Working had a more narrow and more experimental goal: to establish communication with what Crowley described as preterhuman intelligences. What the hell is a preterhuman intelligence? Well, these are entities that were neither gods nor human spirits, but something adjacent to or outside of most known categories. During these sessions, Crowley recorded encounters with multiple entities, the most famous of which he designated Lamb, L-A-M. Now, if anyone's seen pictures of this thing, it looks exactly like a gray alien. You know, before there was such a designation as gray alien, but the similarities of appearance and physiology, etc., are more than uncanny. Crowley didn't describe Lamb as an angel, demon, or deity, but instead he characterized it as an intelligence operating on a plane adjacent to human consciousness, but not bound to human embodiment. Lamb communicated not through moral instruction or revelation, but through symbolic impression and belief, and cryptic transmissions. Crowley's surviving notes suggest he regarded the encounter as genuine contact, but also something incomplete, more like tuning into a signal than hosting a visitation. Crowley didn't mythologize Lamb. He didn't build a cult around it, nor did he elaborate a theology. If anything, he treated the experience as a data point, evidence that non-human intelligences could be accessed through specific ritual and physiological conditions. In the decades following Crowley's death, a number of researchers and occult theorists began to notice a set of unsettling coincidences surrounding the Ultra Working, not as evidence of causation, but as a constellation of patterns that refused to stay buried. The most obvious and most frequently remarked upon is the appearance of Lamb itself. Crowley's drawing of the entity, published in 1919, bears an uncanny resemblance to what would eventually become the stereotypical quote-unquote gray alien form. An enlarged cranium, a fragile body, reduced facial features, and an almost fetal post-sexual morphology. Crowley never described Lamb as an extraterrestrial, but later figures, most notably Kenneth Grant, who we'll also be getting more into later, would argue that the entity represented an early point of contact with what he termed extraterrestrials or transmundane intelligences, accessed not through rockets, but through ritualized consciousness. Grant went even further, suggesting that the Ultra Working functioned less like a summoning and more like the opening of a contact channel, one that didn't close when Crowley stopped participating. In Grant's telling, certain ritual locations act as psychic portals, leaving behind what might be called an energetic residue. Ew. The idea has fueled speculation about the physical site of Crowley's New York workings and whether such quote-unquote thin place over there, could remain active long after the original operation ended. While these claims remain speculative, they introduce a rather provocative question that modern ufology has struggled with: whether contact events are isolated incidents or whether they cluster around conditions both psychological and geographical. It's within this speculative framework that some writers have drawn a line, cautiously and controversially, between the Babalon Working and the Betty and Barney Hill abduction of 1961. The Hills account, often cited as the first widely publicized modern alien abduction narrative, introduced elements that would become familiar: non-human beings with large heads and eyes, medicalized examination, reproductive anxiety, and fragmented memory recovered through altered states. Kenneth Grant and others noted not only the visual parallels to Lamb, but the structural similarities. Contact mediated through consciousness, communication without conventional language, and an overwhelming sense of procedural detachment, rather than any overt hostility or benevolence. No claim of direct connection can be substantiated, nor should one be overstated. What changed between Crowley and the Hills was not phenomenon itself, but the story we tell about it. Crowley's primary takeaway from the Babalon Working was not cosmological certainty, but methodological confirmation. He believed the operation demonstrated that consciousness could interface with non-human intelligences through disciplined ritual practice, altered states, and symbolic mediation. However, he remained cautious. He warned repeatedly about confusing contact with comprehension and about mistaking the existence of such intelligences for benevolence, authority, or purpose aligned in any way with human values, or morality for that matter. And this caution is very important because it helps explain Crowley's later discomfort with attempts to literalize or externalize his ideas, particularly when others treated them as reproductive, world-altering, or potential paths to salvation. Published in 1917, Moonchild is a novel, but one that functions transparently as ritual theory disguised as fiction. The book describes a magical contest between two rival factions attempting to influence the conception of a child who will serve as a vessel for higher forces. One group seeks to produce a spiritually elevated being through disciplined ritual control. The other aims to corrupt or destabilize the process.
Occult eugenics in action.
What matters isn't the plot, but the premise. The idea that sexual reproduction can be deliberately engineered as a magical operation, producing not merely offspring, but a vehicle, continuity structure for forces that cannot otherwise take physical form. The Moonchild is not a messiah, nor a normal human child. It's an interface. Occult eugenics, occult eugenics, occult eugenics. Crowley's decision to present this material as fiction appears deliberate. By doing so, he preserved the ambiguity, avoided dogma, and, importantly, distanced himself from literal attempts to enact such rituals. He understood the volatility of these ideas and treated them as conceptual experiments rather than actual ritual. This context helps clarify why Crowley later criticized Jack Parsons' attempt to perform what became known as the Babalon Working. While Parsons believed he was continuing Crowley's work, Crowley appears to have viewed Parsons' approach as dangerously literal. Where Crowley treated Moonchild logic as symbolic and controlled, Parsons pursued manifestation, embodiment, and externalization. In thelemic literature and correspondence, Crowley repeatedly emphasized restraint, skepticism, and the dangers of obsession with results. He believed contact was possible, but it didn't mean that you had mastered anything. Interaction, but not ownership. Moonchild, in Crowley's framework, was a warning as much as a blueprint. So in retrospect, Lamb occupies a strange position in occult and ufological history. It was never meant to be a god or a leader or a species representative. It was just an example, a demonstration that contact could occur without myth, without morality, and without any narrative payoff. Crowley didn't claim that Lamb wanted anything. That absence is telling. This is why Crowley belongs at the threshold of this fulcrum, not its center. He opens the door and steps back. What comes next is what happens when others decide to walk through that door. When Kenneth Grant begins writing in the decades after Crowley's death, he isn't trying to revive Thelema or preserve a tradition. For those unaware, Thelema is basically the pseudo-religion or occult practice that Crowley codified, more or less. Grant is attempting to document something that, in his view, had already slipped its leash. Grant believed that Crowley's work had not summoned gods or contacted spirits in the traditional sense, but instead it had opened a channel. Once that channel was opened, it didn't close. Grant's central claim, stripped of all the ceremonial language and Kabbalistic mindfuckery games that he's so well known for, is that certain altered states allow human consciousness to become temporarily interactive with something non-human. And among those states, sexual climax occupies as a privileged position. In Grant's writing, sex isn't symbolic, nor is it primarily about intimacy or reproduction. It's treated as a functional interface, a moment when the boundaries that define the self dissolve just enough to permit intrusion, exchange, or overlap. So orgasm in this framework isn't transcendence, it's a vulnerability, it's a liability. The idea immediately reframes centuries of reports involving succubi, incubi, spirit lovers, fairy brides, and later alien abductors. Grant argued that these weren't fantasies layered onto desire, but encounters occurring during moments where the human nervous system was temporarily unguarded. The human body, particularly in states of arousal, sleep, paralysis, or trance, becomes less of a sovereign organism and more of a site, a location where something else can gain traction. Grant gave a name to the condition in which these encounters occur. He called it the Malv Zone. Importantly, the Malv Zone is not a place you travel to, it's a state that overlays the familiar world. People entering it often report that the room around them doesn't vanish, but subtly misaligns. The shape of everything goes wonky and wrong, non-Euclidean geometries. Objects remain where they should be, but feel wrong. Time stretches or folds. The sense of being watched intensifies. Many report the sudden certainty they are no longer alone, even when nothing visible has changed. This description, written decades before the popularization of alien abduction narratives, mirrors modern accounts with unsettling precision. The bedroom remains the bedroom, the walls don't dissolve, but something else is present, and the rules governing interaction no longer apply. Grant insisted this wasn't imagination. He believed that the Malv Zone represented a bandwidth of reality that humans normally pass through unconsciously, except during moments of extreme neurological or emotional disruption, sex being one of the primary conditions for them. One of Grant's most disturbing propositions is that the intelligences encountered in the Malv Zone are not fully autonomous within our reality. They're not gods reigning from afar, nor visitors arriving in craft. They're incomplete entities. Real, ancient, and capable of intention, but unable to fully manifest without human participation. Kind of like quantum observer effects to a degree. In Grant's model, these beings require human minds and bodies in much the same way a parasite requires a host, or a program requires hardware. This relationship isn't framed as worship or possession. It's transactional. Humans provide sensory access, emotional intensity, and biological processes these entities cannot generate on their own. In return, humans receive visions, altered states, encounters, and in many cases, sexual contact that feels invasive, transformative, or both. The implication is difficult to ignore. The encounters are not for us. We are the medium through which something else achieves continuity. Grant extends this idea beyond physical contact and into the realm of symbols. He believed that sigils, names, myths, and even written language could function as living structures, not metaphors, but organisms adapted to survive within human thought. In this view, ideas don't merely spread, they reproduce. Human attention becomes an incubator, and belief is not required. Exposure is enough. This reframing casts a strange light on the evolution of UFO mythology itself. Sightings give rise to stories. Stories give rise to imagery. Imagery gives rise to expectation. Expectation shapes the encounter. Grant would argue that the system feeds itself, gradually refining the forms through which non-human intelligences interact with us. And what begins as a cult ritual in one era becomes a clinical abduction narrative in another, but the underlying mechanics remain consistent. Nowhere is this clearer in Grant's treatment of the entity known as Lamb. Originally encountered by Crowley during a sexual magical operation, Lamb is often described as a being with a hairless head, oversized cranium, emotionless gaze. It's dead ringer or a gray alien. Grant did not treat Lamb as a demon or a god, but as a transmissive intelligence, a mask worn by something that couldn't otherwise be perceived. Lamb, in Grant's writing, is not a singular being, but a channel, a relay. Long before the modern image of the gray alien entered popular culture, Grant was already describing a non-human intelligence that communicated telepathically, appeared during altered sexual states, and seemed less interested in conversation than in access. The resemblance is difficult to dismiss as coincidence, especially given Grant's insistence that such entities don't evolve biologically but adapt culturally, reshaping their presentation to fit the expectations of the era. Spirits, fairies, demons, aliens, it changes over time. Crucially, Grant rejected moral interpretations of these encounters. He didn't describe the intelligences of the night side as evil, nor did he frame humans as chosen or damned. Instead, he treated the night side, another name for the Mauve Zone, as an ecology, a parallel system of life operating according to rules that do not include human ethics. So in this system, humans are neither prey nor partners in any comforting sense. They're resources, interfaces, breeding grounds for ideas, forms, and intelligences that require us but don't resemble us. Taken together, Grant's work suggests that human non-human sexual encounters are not anomalies or cultural delusions, but expressions of a long-standing interface between species that do not share biology, morality, or an origin. What changes over time is not the encounter itself, but the language used to describe it. Once again, devils become fairies, fairies become spirits, spirits become extraterrestrials. But the process remains the same. One of the strangest implications of Kenneth Grant's system is that contact does not occur to a passive human subject. It occurs through an active configuration of awareness. In ritual magic, the operator stands or sits within a deliberately constructed diagram, a circle or square, a sigil-laced chamber designed to isolate, focus, and stabilize consciousness. Grant's claim is that this configuration doesn't merely protect the magician, it defines the conditions under which something else can appear. This begins to resemble what physicists call the observer effect. The idea that observation isn't neutral and that the act of measuring changes the phenomena being measured. In Grant's model, the human observer isn't simply watching an encounter unfold. The observer's body, sexuality, attention, and expectation are part of the apparatus. Without the apparatus, the phenomenon cannot stabilize into form. This is where ritual space and the modern abduction bedroom begin to overlap. Abductees frequently report that encounters occur in liminal states, half asleep, paralyzed, disassociated, sexually aroused even, or emotionally heightened. The body is immobilized. The mind is alert but altered. The environment becomes closed and very strange. So in effect, the experiencer is already quote-unquote in the circle, even if no chalk lines or salt circles were ever drawn on the floor. Grant believed that non-human intelligences require precisely this kind of containment to interact with humans. They don't arrive fully formed and then act upon a person. Instead, they coalesce within the parameters provided by the human nervous system. This makes the experiencer both witness and infrastructure. The encounter is not staged for them, it's staged through them. Sexuality becomes critical here, not because it's pleasurable, but because it destabilizes identity. Once again, cult leaders, all the big ones, whether they knew it consciously or not, this is a big part of some of their practices. During sexual arousal and climax, the brain temporarily suspends the mechanisms that maintain a stable sense of self. This is neurologically observable. In Grant's system, that suspension creates a gap, and gaps are where contact occurs. And the entities encountered during these moments are not exploiting sex, they're exploiting the permeability that sex provides. This reframing casts new light on a reoccurring feature of abduction narratives, the apparent procedural focus on reproduction. Abductees across decades describing genital examination, extraction of sperm and ovum, implantation, forced arousal, or the presentation of hybrid offspring. Grant's model doesn't interpret these acts symbolically. He treats them as functional. Sexual biology is the most efficient interface between consciousness and matter. If a non-human intelligence seeks continuity in our reality, the reproductive system is not incidental, it's optimal. Consider the case of Whitley Strieber.
This is gonna be so terrible. Another day down the toilet. Big dark eyes, like a... No, more like an insect. Long face, thin, not human. I don't recall them being human. 4 or 5 feet, like big kids. Here I am, I'm naked. I'm naked. I'm talking to you like you were real. Go to hell. Now give me a kiss. Something wrong with you?
His encounters consistently blur terror, intimacy, and erotic intrusion. Strieber reports episodes of paralysis accompanied by sexual stimulation, followed by the presence of non-human beings who seem less interested in his consent than in his capacity to remain conscious during the experience. Grant wouldn't interpret this as violation by external invaders, but as the consequence of an interface being activated without the experiencer understanding its function. Similarly, the works of Dr. David Jacobs documents abductees who report being trained to interact sexually with hybrid entities, often described as emotionally flat, visually humanoid, and intensely focused on reproductive outcomes. In Grant's language, these hybrids would not be offspring in the conventional sense, but projections stabilized through repeated human participation. The sexual act becomes a calibration process, refining the interface over time. Another striking parallel emerges in cases involving so-called, quote-unquote, screen memories. The owls are not what they seem. Abductees often recall owls, deer, or vague figures that later resolve into non-human forms under hypnosis. Grant anticipated this mechanism decades earlier. He argued that the human mind supplies familiar imagery to buffer itself against ontological shock.
Processing.
The anxiety of the unreal. The entity does not choose its mask arbitrarily. The mask is generated by the point of contact, the human, shaped by the observer's cultural and psychological framework. This is why Grant insisted that these intelligences are not fixed beings, but adaptive processes. They don't evolve biologically, they evolve narratively. Each encounter leaves residue. Images, myths, expectations, strange ectoplasms, etc., that shape the next encounter. Over time, the system optimizes itself. What begins as ritual demonology becomes fairy lore. Fairy lore becomes spirit visitation. Spirit visitation becomes extraterrestrial abduction. The interface improves over time. The experience becomes more repeatable. The sexual component persists across all of these phases, not because humans are obsessed with sex, although here's 6 episodes of it, but because sex is one of the few states in which observer apparatus reliably destabilizes itself. The human body becomes compliant. The mind becomes permeable. Memory fragments. The encounter leaves physical, emotional, and narrative traces without ever fully solidifying into proof. Grant's most unsettling contribution is his refusal to assign intent in human terms. He doesn't ask whether these intelligences are benevolent or malevolent. He asks whether they are viable. So from that perspective, the encounters don't represent an invasion so much as a symbiosis, one that humans did not consciously agree to, but have nonetheless sustained for centuries through ritual, myth, and now technology-mediated belief. When abductees report that the beings seem indifferent to suffering, Grant would say this is because suffering is not part of the exchange. The exchange is access, sensation, continuity. The observer is not being punished or rewarded. They're being used as a stabilizing nexus or node in a system that predates modern categories of science, religion, or psychology. So seen this way, the question of disclosure becomes almost irrelevant. You can't disclose a system that requires participation to exist. You can't reveal something whose primary camouflage is the observer's own mind.
I'm freaking out, man. You are freaking out, man.
And what Grant offers instead is a grimly elegant hypothesis that human sexuality, consciousness, and narrative imagination together form a gateway, and that something has been walking through it for a very long time. Before going any further, it's worth pausing to address a variable that almost never gets treated with the seriousness it deserves: expectation. Not belief in the simplistic sense, but the deep cultural and psychological frameworks people bring with them into anomalous experiences. What a person enters these encounters expecting, whether consciously or unconsciously, appears to have an enormous influence on how these encounters are perceived, remembered, and interpreted. If perception is the interface, then expectation is the filter. This may help explain why so many encounters reported within predominantly Christian cultures are framed through fear, violation, and spiritual threat. For centuries, Western religious programming has conditioned people to interpret non-human intelligences as either angels or demons, saviors or corruptors. And when something unfamiliar intrudes into consciousness, especially during vulnerable states like sleep paralysis, illness, or sexual arousal, the mind reaches for the nearest available narrative scaffolding. Very often, more often than not, that scaffolding is fear. And this raises an uncomfortable possibility. A significant portion of the negativity associated with these encounters may not be inherent to the phenomenon itself, but emergent from the cultural lenses through which it's processed. This doesn't mean the experiences are imagined or benevolent or quote-unquote chosen in any simplistic sense. It means that interpretation isn't neutral. It's conditioned. This is where the idea I've referred to elsewhere as tulpatronics begins to kind of take shape. The suggestion is not that people consciously create entities through belief, but that large-scale cultural narratives, reinforced through religion, media, and institutional authority, can shape the forms anomalous experiences take. Over time, expectations harden into the architecture of an encounter. The story feeds the experience, which feeds the story in a recursive loop. Seen through this lens, mass media representations of aliens, demons, and cosmic threats take on new significance. Whether intentional or not, they may function as training data for the human imagination, preloading fear, hostility, and hierarchy into encounters that might otherwise be ambiguous. Hey folks, future me just jumping in real quick to clarify a note on the idea of tulpatronics. Predominantly, I think that there is at least some group or faction that is responsible for using popular culture, science fiction, speculative fiction, Hollywood blockbusters, etc., that deals with all this kind of different anomalous phenomena that you may experience in quote-unquote real life. And it's very much intentionally trying to shape our perceptions. The nefarious fiction cartel out there. It's not all fiction, but it's a lot of it. Okay, back to the future I go. And this is where discussions of groups like the so-called Collins elite become relevant, not as proven conspiracies, but as hypotheses about narrative control and perceptual framing. Even without overt coordination, cultural gravity alone may be enough to steer interpretation in a particular direction. At the same time, it's important to resist swinging to the opposite extreme. Not every encounter is benevolent. Not every experience can be reframed as healing or helpful. The point is not to replace one dogma with another. Quote-unquote ultra-terrestrial overlords swapped for a cosmic space brothers. Both are limiting. Both collapse complexity into comfort. A useful example here is Travis Walton, who for decades described his experience as terrifying and traumatic, only later in life reframing it as an emergency intervention, an attempt by non-human beings to repair the damage that they themselves had caused. That reframing did not erase the fear or the violation, but it altered the narrative arc. The beings became less like monsters and more like interdimensional veterinarians. Or not. No. Dangerous, indifferent, but not malicious in any human sense. I believe Whitley Strieber also ultimately came to a very similar realization and or conclusion.
I told you, don't touch my stuff. I shall return. I am the dreamer. You are the dream. Get up! I'm cooking.
I can only speculate, but I bet it's pretty good shit that he's on. The deeper issue, and perhaps the most uncomfortable one, is that despite mountains of data, testimony, speculation, we still don't know what this phenomenon is. Not really. And admitting that, truly admitting it, is something many people find intolerable, distasteful, unwholesome, loathsome, icky, poo-poo, pee-pee, caca. They just ain't having it. Certainty, even false certainty, is often preferred to ambiguity. History shows that the people most responsible for violence, oppression, and catastrophe are those who claim to know the truth with absolute confidence. So in that sense, ufology almost mirrors religion. We're faced with an abyss of data and experience. The most honest position available to us remains deeply unsatisfying. We don't know. We can say it may be, it seems, it appears, it might suggest, but certainly remains out of reach. Rather than treating it as failure, it may be more productive to treat it as a foundation, a trunk from which many speculative branches can grow without mistaking any one of them for the whole tree. And then you got the forest for the trees, etc. The question of expectation, narrative shaping, and cultural conditioning deserves far deeper exploration than we can give it here. Later, we'll return to it directly, looking at how fiction, religion, media, and power structures interact symbolically with anomalous experiences, and how imagination itself may be one of the most contested battlegrounds in whatever this phenomena ultimately is. For now, the key point is simple but profound. The encounter does not arrive in a vacuum. It arrives into a mind space already furnished. Mind Kia. If Kenneth Grant's ideas were merely speculative philosophy, we would expect them to collapse when confronted with real-world cases. Instead, what's unsettling is how often modern abduction narratives appear to behave exactly the way his model predicts, particularly when sexuality enters the frame. The encounters do not arrive as isolated events. They unfold as processes, escalating over time, adapting to the experiencer and leaving behind psychological, bodily, and narrative residue. Consider the early abduction cases documented by Bud Hopkins in the 1970s and 80s. Many begin with vague childhood memories, strange dreams, recurrent paralysis, a sense of presence in the bedroom. As adulthood progresses, the encounters become more explicit and more procedural. Sexual examination emerges gradually, often accompanied by forced arousal or the extraction of reproductive material. What Hopkins found most disturbing was not the acts themselves, but the consistency with which they appeared across unrelated individuals who had no prior knowledge of one another's accounts. Grant would have recognized this pattern immediately. In his system, contact is rarely abrupt. It's cultivated. The interface improves with repetition. Early encounters establish the permeability, while later encounters exploit it. The case of Carla Turner offers a particularly unsettling example. Turner reported experiences involving reproductive extraction, sexual violation, and the presentation of hybrid children. But what sets her testimony apart is her insistence that the beings were neither benevolent nor overtly hostile. They were managerial. Oh, I can imagine a Karen getting abducted right now, and it's making me feel all chuckly inside.
I'd like to speak to the manager of this so-called UFO. Not even up to UAP standards now.
I've been up all night recording and editing. They can't all be 100%, okay? And I can't just run the Christopher Walken montage into the ground. Not just yet. Gotta get a lot of shelf life out of that thing. Task-oriented. They were task-oriented, emotionally indifferent. Sexuality was not framed as intimacy or domination, but as logistics. Bureaucracy. The body was accessed the way a technician accesses a system, efficiently and without ceremony. And this framing aligns uncomfortably well with Grant's view that non-human intelligences are less interested in humans as individuals than as functional access points. The sexual dimension persists not because of desire, but because reproduction in any form is a stabilizing mechanism. Something is being continued. More obscure cases push this further into Grantian territory. In several European abduction reports from the 1950s and 60s, experiencers describe encounters with small, pale beings who initiate sexual contact without overt physical force. The experiencers often report an eerie calm, a sense of emotional flattening, and afterwards a confusion about whether consent was ever provided or even possible. These cases predate the widespread circulation of gray alien imagery, yet describe beings that are functionally identical, hairless, large-headed, minimally expressive, intensely focused on bodily interaction. Grant's insistence that such entities are not fixed species but adaptive intelligences becomes difficult to dismiss here. The beings do not evolve biologically across cases, they converge operationally. Even stranger are cases involving long-term sexual relationships that blur the line between abduction and partnership. Some experiencers report recurring encounters with a single non-human figure who appears over years or even decades, often initiating sexual contact during sleep or trance. These encounters are frequently accompanied by instruction, symbolic imagery, or the sense of being trained. Ooh. Grant would classify these as interface optimization events. The human subject becomes increasingly compatible with the intelligence over time. This echoes medieval accounts of spirit spouses and fairy lovers, where sexual contact is accompanied by altered fertility, prophetic knowledge, or gradual withdrawal from ordinary social life. The language changes across centuries, but the mechanics stay the same. One of the most disturbing parallels emerges in cases involving sexual trauma without overt physical contact. Many abductees report sensations of penetration, arousal, or climax in the absence of any visible bodily interaction. Medical examinations frequently find no physical injury. Grant anticipated this phenomenon as well, arguing that contact need not be fully embodied. The nervous system itself can be stimulated directly, and in such cases, the body becomes a proxy interface, responding as if touched even when no conventional contact occurs. This raises an unsettling question. If the encounter is occurring at the level of perception and sensation rather than flesh, where exactly does it take place? Grant's answer would be in the mauve zone, a reality condition in which mind and matter briefly overlap without fully merging. The sexual act in this context is neither hallucination nor assault in the ordinary sense. It's an event occurring in a domain where our categories fail. The hybrid child narratives reported by figures like David Jacobs or Bud Hopkins, subjects push this model to its limit. Experiencers describe being shown children who appear partly human, partly other, often eliciting strong emotional responses.
That's not my baby.
Some report being encouraged to bond with these children, quote-unquote children. Others report being tested for emotional suitability. Grant would interpret these not as literal offspring in the human sense, but as stabilized projections, forms that require emotional investment to persist. Sexuality initiates the process, and attachment sustains it. The strangest cases, however, are those in which the experiencer reports a shift in the encounter's tone over time. Fear gives way to neutrality. Neutrality gives way to something like cooperation. In rare instances, the experiencer reframes the entire sequence as functional rather than malicious. Travis Walton's later reinterpretation of his own experience falls squarely into this category. Whitley Strieber as well.
Today's secret word is...
Whitley Strieber.
I'm telling you, you're in for one big surprise. One very big surprise. Really, because, you know, like a knock-knock joke in Hindu. A Hindu knock-knock joke. Terrible day. Oy vey, what a day, what a schmear. Another day down the toilet. Crack the whip. Drive the slaves off to another cocktail party. Leave it that way. I like it that way. I like my workplace for trust. It's like I can't see anything but the inside of my own head. Not human. I don't recall them being human. 4 or 5 feet, like big kids. I'm seeing someone there. I don't think I like this. I shall return. I can't wake up. Nope, I don't think so. This is no good. I can't do this.
You know, I just want to say that you guys are the #1 greatest fucking audience anyone could ever have. And you're patient and you're understanding, and you get that, yes, it's probably boring to edit, and most of the stuff I do in the midst of all this to pretty much entertain myself. But I hope you like it too. Hope you like it too. Promise, that's the last time I'm going to do that. Back to the show. The actual show. For show. What begins as terror was later understood, at least by Walken himself, as emergency intervention. Beings attempting to repair harm caused by their own technology. Grant wouldn't argue that this interpretation reveals the quote-unquote truth of the encounter. He would argue that it reveals the adaptability of the interface. As expectation changes, so does the form the encounter takes. The phenomenon is not fixed, it's responsive. Perhaps the most unsettling implication of these case studies is not that non-human intelligences are interacting with humans sexually, but that they appear to learn from those interactions. Each encounter leaves behind not just trauma or memory, but data. The system refines itself. The beings become more efficient. The encounters become more controlled. The stories become more consistent. If this is correct, then the question is no longer whether abductions are real, symbolic, or psychological. The question becomes whether humanity has been participating, unknowingly and unevenly, in the construction of a cross-species interface for far longer than we are comfortable admitting. And if that interface is shaped as much by expectation, culture, and narrative as by biology, then the stories we tell about these encounters are not just descriptions, they're instructions. One of the earliest and most frequently cited cases involving explicit sexual contact comes from Brazil in 1957. Now, I don't know what it is. This is just a quick aside. I don't know what it is about Brazil specifically, but the number of men who have been abducted and, for lack of a better term, coerced into engaging in sexual intercourse with an alien from Brazil that have taken place in Brazil is a ridiculous amount. I can think of at least 3 off the top of my head. I don't remember all their names, but hey, future me again. Here they go. Antonio Villas-Boas, Antonio Carlos Ferreira, Jose Alvaro, and Liberato Anibal Quinterno. And you know what? I think there's several more besides them. Yeah. Mind-boggling, but good for them, I guess. It's quite a bit. Like more than... It's just weird, the concentration, the amount, the number in just one specific geographical area. Boys from Brazil. Antonio Villas-Boas, 23-year-old farmer from Sao Paulo, Francisco de Sales, reported being taken aboard a craft after encountering strange lights while working at night. According to his account, documented by Brazilian journalist João Martins, and later investigated by Dr. Olavo Fontes, Villas-Boas was subjected to medical procedures before being introduced to a nude female humanoid with pale skin, blue eyes, and bright red pubic hair. The two engaged in sexual intercourse, after which she gestured toward her abdomen and then towards the sky, which Villas-Boas interpreted as some form of reproductive purpose. He was returned to Earth distressed, nauseous, and later reportedly suffered radiation-like symptoms. What makes the Villas-Boas case foundational is that it establishes, decades before the modern abduction narrative fully crystallized, a fully formed template. Medicalized control, enforced intimacy, symbolic communication, and an unclear reproductive agenda. This is not a story of romance or seduction. It's procedural, detached, and strangely ritualistic. Jump forwards to September 19th, 1961 in New Hampshire. Betty and Barney Hill's abduction is often remembered for its interracial dimension and early hypnosis sessions, but less commonly discussed is the sexualized subtext present in Betty's recollections. Under hypnosis conducted by Dr. Benjamin Simon in 1964, Betty described a pelvic examination conducted with a needle-like instrument, followed by telepathic reassurance from the beings when she expressed fear of pain. While not overtly sexual, the invasive focus on reproductive anatomy and the emotional modulation employed by the entities places this case squarely within the same interface framework. Here, sexuality is not explicit, but reproduction, bodily access, and emotional regulation are central. The beings do not behave as explorers or scientists, but as technicians operating within a pre-existing protocol. And just real quick, if you haven't heard any of the tapes, the recordings of the Betty and Barney Hill hypnosis sessions, I highly recommend you check them out. As a matter of fact, I'm about to play a portion of them. This is a piece from Barney's hypnosis session, and you don't feel this man's fear, or at least feel that this man is utterly overcome by fear. I don't know what to tell you. So, fair warning, some people find it very unsettling. I'll let the audio speak for itself.
It's pounding in my head. This pull the binoculars away. God, give me strength.
All right.
Pull them down. Run! Pull these binoculars down and run. God, if there's a God, give me strength. I gotta get away. Oh, baby.
All right.
We gotta get away, baby.
All right. Calm down.
I'm trying. I gotta get away.
In November 1975, Travis Walton disappeared for 5 days after an encounter with a luminous object in the Apache Sitgreaves National Forest in Arizona. Walton later described waking inside a craft, restrained, surrounded by non-human entities. Although his account does not involve sexual contact, it's critical to include because of what came later. In interviews decades after the event, Walton stated that he had come to believe the beings were attempting to save his life after injuring him with an energy discharge. This reframing from attack to intervention highlights the role of expectation and interpretation in shaping the narrative of contact. This shift mirrors a broader pattern seen across experiencer testimonies. Terror gives way to ambiguity, and ambiguity sometimes gives way to a reluctant acceptance. To understand how these narratives intersect with sexuality more overtly, we return to Whitley Strieber.
This is no good. I can't do this.
Beginning in the 1980s, Strieber reported repeated encounters with non-human entities detailed in Communion, 1987, and subsequent works. Strieber described bedroom visitations, paralysis, invasive procedures, and ambiguous sexual elements, including genital contact and various reproductive themes. Over time, his interpretation evolved from fear to a more complex, if still very disturbing, sense of participation in an ongoing process. Something kind of like a ritual, perhaps. Strieber's importance lies not just in his experience, but in his willingness to discuss the psychosexual destabilization that these encounters produced, how intimacy without consent collapses normal categories of desire, violation, and meaning. Now rewind further, the contactee era of the 1950s. George Adamski, perhaps the most famous of the contactees, claimed repeated meetings with benevolent humanoids from Venus beginning in 1952. Adamski's accounts lack any overt sexuality, but they are suffused with a kind of sublimated eroticism, perfect bodies, serene gazes, and a sense of chosen intimacy. The human is singled out, invited, and transformed by proximity to the other. Orfeo Angelucci, another contactee of the same era, went further. In The Secret of the Saucers, 1955, Angelucci described ecstatic encounters with luminous beings that induced overwhelming feelings of love, unity, and physical pleasure bordering on the erotic. These experiences were framed spiritually, but the bodily dimension is unmistakable. Here we see sexuality displaced rather than absent, transmuted into spiritual ecstasy, but still operating through the nervous system and emotional core. Now, shifting away from ufology and into ritual history, in 1918, Aleister Crowley conducted a series of workings in New York with Roddy Minor that resulted in the reception of non-human intelligence named Lamb. Crowley later depicted Lamb as a hairless, large-headed being strikingly similar to what would later be called a Grey. These workings involved prolonged sexual abstinence, trance states, and visionary contact rather than physical sex, but they established the ritual mechanics of interface contact long before modern abduction narratives. In 1946, rocket scientist and Thelemite Jack Parsons conducted the Babalon Working in Pasadena, California, alongside Lafayette Ronald Hubbard. The ritual explicitly sought to incarnate a non-human feminine intelligence through sex magic. Parsons believed the operation succeeded, noting profound psychological and synchronistic disruptions afterwards. Kenneth Grant later drew explicit lines between these ritual events and modern UFO encounters, arguing that both represented breaches between human consciousness and non-human intelligence mediated through sex, trance, and symbolic expectation. Taken together, these cases form a disturbing continuity. Across continents and decades, the same motifs recur: paralysis, altered states, bodily access, emotional alteration, and encounters that resist simple moral categorization. Whether framed as demons, angels, space brothers, or interdimensional entities, the mechanics remain stable. What changes is not the phenomenon, but the story we bring with us when we meet it. In March of 1967, in Ashland, Nebraska, police officer Herbert Shermer, delicious name, makes me think of ice cream, reported an encounter that would later be investigated by Dr. J. Allen Hynek and detailed in Ray Fowler's The Andreasen Affair appendix material. Shermer described stopping a hovering craft during a routine patrol. He was taken aboard and subjected to what he interpreted as medical examination, including intense focus on his groinial area and lower abdomen. Under hypnosis, Shermer described humanoid beings with slit mouths and emblematic serpent imagery on their uniforms. He's not the only one that's encountered non-human entities with these serpent patches on their uniforms. It's shown up in completely separate encounter events, separated by great deals of time and space. The encounter was accompanied by enforced calm and emotional suppression. Shermer's life, Shermer's life later deteriorated into paranoia, obsession, and psychological instability, what we would now call a failed interface, where the experiencer never reintegrates. What makes Shermer's case especially disturbing is the symbolic overlay. Serpent insignia, bodily control, and sexualized medical attention combined with a breakdown of personal identity. It reads less like an alien encounter and more like an initiation that goes catastrophically wrong. I believe he lost his job, was divorced by his wife, and then someone eventually burned down his house. One of the worst cases of overreacting to a man having a strange experience that you'll ever read about. In 1978, in Turin, Italy, a young woman known under the pseudonym Anna K. reported a series of encounters later summarized in Corrado Malonga's earlier abduction research. Anna described being removed from her bedroom repeatedly by tall, luminous beings who communicated through emotion rather than language. Sexual contact occurred, but not in any conventional sense. Anna described the act as quote-unquote merging, accompanied by paralysis and a sensation of being observed by additional unseen presences. She later developed dissociative symptoms and reoccurring dreams involving geometric chambers and rotating symbols. Here, sexuality ceases to be an act and becomes a state, a condition imposed upon consciousness while the body functions as a passive foundation. In September 1969, in Berkshire, England, multiple witnesses, including children, reported encounters with non-human entities during what became known as the Berkshire UFO Flap. One lesser-known account involves a teenage girl later interviewed privately by British researcher Ginny Randalls, who describes being led into a wooded area by a tall, silent figure. The being touched her forehead and chest, producing sensations of warmth and emotional overwhelm. No overt sexual contact had occurred, no sexual act took place, but the encounter left her with lifelong reoccurring bodily memories and a profound sense of violated intimacy she struggled to articulate. These cases illustrate how sexual trauma can exist without sex, through invasive intimacy, neurological stimulation, and the collapse of bodily autonomy. In 1983, in the Canary Islands, a Spanish fisherman named Jose Padron reported being taken aboard a craft where he encountered a female-presenting humanoid entity. The interaction involved physical contact in what Padron described as, quote, instruction through sensation, unquote. He later stated that the encounter felt neither consensual nor hostile, but compulsory, as if fulfilling some role. Spanish ufologist Vicente Juan Ballester Olmos noted the case's strong resemblance to earlier European succubus legends. Here, the folkloric and the ufological collapse into each other. Strip away the technology, and the narrative could have been recorded in the 14th century. In 1992, in the Russian city of Voronezh, a wave of encounters followed a public UFO landing witnessed by children. While the case is often dismissed, a lesser-known follow-up involved a young woman who later claimed repeated visitation by a tall, free-eyed being. She described enforced nudity, examination, and a cold, ritualized form of physical contact that ceased abruptly after she became pregnant, though no pregnancy resulted. Whether true, exaggerated, or misinterpreted, the reproductive framing is unmistakable, and again, procedural rather than emotional. In the early 2000s, Brazilian researcher Irene Granchi documented a series of encounters in rural Minas Gerais involving women who reported nocturnal visitations accompanied by sexual paralysis and luminous beings. One subject described an entity she called, quote-unquote, the Thin One, who appeared during sleep paralysis episodes and engaged in repeated genital contact. The woman later reported chronic fatigue and endocrine abnormalities. Endocrine abnormalities. These cases blur the line between abduction, parasomnia, and something else entirely, but the structure, once again, remains consistent. Not all encounters involve the body directly. In 1974 in Wales, schoolteacher Berwyn Williams reported prolonged contact with non-human intelligences during trance states induced through meditation. Williams described being shown symbolic sexual unions between human and non-human forms framed as quote-unquote templates rather than the events. He later became socially isolated, convinced that he was a conduit for an ongoing program. This is another quote-unquote failed interface. No overt trauma, but total identity negation. And then there are the cases that defy even any internal coherence. In 1954, in Caracas, Venezuela, a man identified only as R reported being physically fused to an entity during an encounter, describing sensations of overlapping limbs and shared perception. The experience ended with what he called a quote-unquote separation wound, although there was no physical injury, but he did suffer from lasting depersonalization. At this point, the phenomenon ceases to resemble contact at all. It becomes intrusion upon reality itself. Across these accounts, famous and obscure, medical and mystical, sexual and symbolic, the same architecture appears again and again. The human subject is isolated, control is imposed, intimacy occurs without negotiation, meaning is deferred or withheld, interpretation arrives later, if at all. This is the apex strangeness. Not that these events happen, but that they happen in the same way, across cultures, belief systems, and technological eras. And it is from this unstable ground that Kenneth Grant and the Typhonian tradition steps forward, not to explain the phenomenon away, but to say something far more unsettling. That these encounters are not aberrations. It's in the next phase, where we pivot into ritual case studies from the Typhonian corpus and adjacent magical operations, showing that the same patterns emerge when humans attempt to summon rather than be taken. And that is where things get truly dangerous. In 1947 in London, Kenneth Grant and members of the post-Crowley OTO began a series of informal workings intended to extend Crowley's unfinished exploration of non-human intelligences contacted through sex, trance, and dream work. Grant later described these early operations as attempts to, quote, tune consciousness to zones outside human time, unquote. Participants reported vivid dreams involving hybrid entities, sexualized paralysis states, and sensations of being observed from behind reality. One unnamed participant reportedly withdrew after experiencing what Grant called, quote, an obsessional fixation on invisible partners, unquote. A classic, quote-unquote, failed interface where desire detaches from human relational context. Grant insists repeatedly that these were not symbolic experiences, they were invasions. In 1955, in California, rocket scientist Jack Parsons, already deeply destabilized following the Babalon Working, conducted solo ritual experiments attempting to recontact the feminine intelligence he believed he had helped incarnate. According to his private notes, Parsons experienced nocturnal visitations accompanied by sexual arousal, sleep paralysis, and what he described as, quote, presence pressing inward, unquote. Within months, he was dead in an explosion under circumstances still debated. Grant later interpreted Parsons not as a martyr, but as a warning, an operator who opened a gate without knowing how to close it. In the late 1950s, British occultist and Grant associate Charles Stansfield Jones, also known as Frater Akkad, began reporting spontaneous visionary episodes involving what he believed were post-human intelligences. Akkad described erotic dreams in which human sexuality dissolved into abstract geometries, often accompanied by terror and elation in equal measure. His later writings become increasingly fragmented, and he died in relative obscurity, convinced he had broken the temporal order of consciousness itself. Here, sexuality ceases to function biologically at all. It becomes a translation layer. In the early 1960s, Grant documented what he called the Lamb Current, a psychic stream he believed was reactivated following Crowley's 1918 Amalantra workings. Grant asserted that Lamb was not a single entity, but a mask through which a class of non-human intelligences interacted with humanity. Ritual participants attempting Lamb visualizations frequently reported sexual dreams involving hairless, fetal-like beings, followed by intense dread upon awakening. Several ceased magical practice entirely afterwards. At this point, the resemblance to gray abduction narratives becomes impossible to ignore, not because Grant predicts them, but because he describes their internal mechanisms decades earlier. In 1972, in Germany, occultist Eugen Grosch, aka Frater Gregorius, conducted experiments combining sex magic with scrying mirrors. One operation reportedly resulted in a female participant experiencing repeated quote-unquote visitations during sleep, in which a presence engaged her sexually while transmitting images of star-like voids and tunnels. The experiences stopped only after the mirror was destroyed. This mirrors modern reports where abductees claim encounters cease after intentional psychological resistance or symbolic disruption. Again, interface mechanics as opposed to beings. Grant also recounts secondhand reports from Indian tantric practitioners who warned that certain sexual rites were never meant to be performed without lineage protection, as they attracted what were described as quote-unquote formless watchers. These watchers were said to induce pleasure to gain access, eventually hollowing out the practitioner's sense of self, perhaps in order to replace it. Strip away the language, and the warning is identical to modern abductee accounts of gradual identity erosion. Now, consider a chilling convergence. In the 1980s, American UFO researcher Bud Hopkins documented cases where abductees reported sexual interactions with hybrid beings who appeared partially human partially other. One woman described being instructed emotionally, not verbally, to nurture a childlike entity that felt familiar yet alien. Hopkins struggled to interpret these accounts, but Grant would have recognized the structure immediately. Ritualized intimacy used to stabilize a non-human presence within human psychic space. Grant explicitly argues that this is the goal. Not invasion, not conquest, but habitation through interface. And then there are the cases Grant only hints at. In Beyond the Moth Zone, Grant references unnamed quote-unquote Western magicians who attempted to sexualize dream contact with non-human intelligences and subsequently lost the ability to distinguish waking life from trance states. One reportedly attempted suicide after becoming convinced his physical body was quote-unquote obsolete. Sounds kind of like what Heaven's Gate was getting into a little bit. These are not initiations, these are casualties. Across all of this, abductions, contactee ecstasies, for lack of a better word, ritual disasters, etc., the same pattern asserts itself with mechanical indifference. A human consciousness is isolated, normal sensory rules are suspended, intimacy is imposed or invited, identity destabilizes, meaning fractures. So sex is not the goal, but the tool. This is the Typhonian thesis in its rawest form, that sexuality functions as a point of access through which non-human intelligences interface with human thought. Not metaphorically, but operationally. And once you see that, the question stops being, are these experiences real? And the question becomes, who or what designed the interface? In 1909 in Paris, occultist and psychologist Theodore Flournoy documented the medium Helene Smith, whose trance states produced elaborate encounters with what she believed were Martian intelligences. While Smith framed these as spiritual communications, Flournoy noted intense somatic responses during trance, including bodily sensations of presence, touch, and emotional intimacy. Though not ritual sex in a ceremonial sense, Smith's sessions followed a repeatable protocol: darkened room, focused intention, symbolic language, functionally identical to later contact rituals. Oh yeah, it's a thing. What makes Smith, we'll get into it, what makes Smith relevant is that the entities adapted to her expectations, mirroring language, symbolism, and affect, an early demonstration of what would later be called, in my own vocab, tulpatronics. In 1974, in Cefalù, Sicily, members of Crowley's Abbey of Thelema reported a series of visionary disturbances following prolonged ritual experimentation. One female initiate described repeated nocturnal visitations involving paralysis, the sense of presence, and an involuntary physiological arousal, accompanied by terror. Crowley dismissed these as psychological imbalance, but later Grant would explicitly reinterpret them as premature exposure to non-human currents without adequate containment. This is one of the earliest examples of a failed magical interface producing what modern researchers would recognize as abduction-like symptoms. In the late 1930s, German occultist Karl or Germer, I'm not sure which one, but Crowley's successor in the OTO, he reported spontaneous dream contacts following sex magic experiments intended to stabilize thelemic currents. Germer described non-human intelligences using symbolic female forms to communicate directives. These encounters ceased only after he abandoned the ritual workings. Here again, the pattern: ritual leads to contact, contact leads to destabilization, destabilization leads to the shutting off, the withdrawal from transactions or interactions, but not a banishment. In the 1960s, members of the Fraternitas Saturni in Germany conducted ritual experiments involving sigillized sexual polarity and mirror gazing. One operation resulted in a male participant reporting repeated bedroom visitations by a shadowy feminine form. The lodge classified the events as quote-unquote threshold breach and suspended further experimentation. The lodge's response is telling. The problem was not belief, but access. Or at least preventing or regulating access. In 1974, occult researcher Sybil Leek described participating in group rituals where participants later reported dreamlike encounters with tall, luminous beings offering instructions through sensation rather than speech. Leek explicitly warned that ritual contact often, quote, bleeds into domestic space, unquote, an observation echoed decades later in abduction literature. At this point, the ritual/abduction divide is no longer theoretical, it's more experiential. In the late 1980s, chaos magician Phil Hine documented cases in which practitioners performed sigil magic aimed at, quote, non-human intelligences, unquote, experienced spontaneous sexual imagery, bodily sensations, and intrusive thoughts. Hine emphasized that the experiences were not desired outcomes, but side effects of contact with what he called, quote-unquote, autonomous complexes. And this is crucial. Intent does not determine outcome, structure does. Grant himself recounts a particularly obscure incident in Outer Gateways, one of his books in the Typhonian trilogies, involving a female ritualist who attempted to contact Typhonian intelligences through dream incubation. She later reported recurring sensations of being quote-unquote tuned, followed by loss of libido and emotional flattening. Grant classified this as energy displacement, not possession. Again, no demons, no aliens, just interface malfunction. By the time we reach the late 20th century, the technology changes, but the operational logic does not. CE5 protocols, Close Encounter 5, popularized by Stephen Greer in the 1990s, strip away ceremonial language and replace it with meditation, visualization, emotional coherence, and group intention. No robes, no sigils, no gods. Unless they want to, I don't know. Very close to chaos magic, you can jazz it up however you want, I guess. But just consciousness as the ritual space. From an anthropological perspective, CE5 is ritual magic with modern branding. A minimalized interface protocol optimized for accessibility. And this is where things get especially interesting because unlike classic occultism, CE5 leaves a massive digital footprint. By the early 1990s, the ritual architecture that once required temples, initiations, and sexual polarity had been radically simplified. Stephen Greer's CE5 framework replaced ceremonial magic with meditation, visualization, emotional coherence, and group intention. The language changed, the structure did not. Participants were instructed to focus on peaceful contact, to visualize location and welcome, and to emotionally attune themselves as if contact were already occurring. From an anthropological perspective, this is indistinguishable from invocation without the mythical framing, a stripped-down interface protocol designed for mass participation. The thing to note is that CE5 does not produce uniform results. In 1993, during early CE5 field experiments in, where else? The California desert, multiple participants reported light phenomena following coordinated meditation sessions. One participant, later interviewed anonymously in UFO magazine, described a sudden shift from visual phenomena to a deeply unsettling bodily sensation. Pressure on the chest, paralysis, and the sense of being quote-unquote noticed. The individual withdrew from further sessions, reporting recurring sleep disturbances afterwards. This is a classic interface bleed. Contact does not remain external. In 1997, a CE5 group operating near, where else? Mount Shasta, reported what they described as a successful contact event. Stationary lights responding to group signaling. However, one female participant later described a sequence of vivid dreams involving tall, indistinct beings standing near her bed. No sexual contact was described, but the dreams involved enforced closeness and emotional manipulation. She later stated she felt the experience had quote-unquote followed her home, aka the hitchhiker effect. Again, we see the same pattern observed in ritual magic, domestic space invasion following deliberate contact. By the early 2000s, CE5 narratives began appearing online in forums and early blogs. One particularly obscure account, archived on a now defunct Yahoo group dedicated to human-initiated contact, involved a man who claimed repeated CE5 success through solo meditation. He reported an escalating progression, lights giving way to sensed presence, giving way to tactile sensations during sleep paralysis. The final stage involved what he described as, quote, sexualized energy exchange without imagery, unquote. He ceased the practice after experiencing depersonalization and emotional flattening. This is not benevolence or malevolence. This is protocol escalation. A 2008 account posted to a meditation forum, not explicitly UFO related, described a practitioner who unintentionally reproduced CE5 mechanics while attempting Kundalini work. The individual reported sensations of being quote-unquote entered energetically during trance, followed by weeks of intrusive imagery and loss of agency during meditation. Commenters encouraged grounding and ceasing all practice. What's notable here is convergence without cross-pollination. The same interface appears whether the practitioner believes in aliens, chakras, or nothing at all. In 2012, a CE5 participant interviewed by journalist John Ronson, off record and later paraphrased, described group sessions that produced euphoria and bonding, but also interpersonal breakdowns. Romantic obsession, projection, and sexual fixation within the group increased dramatically following repeated contact attempts. The participant linked it to, quote, opening a door and forgetting it stays open, unquote. This mirrors cult dynamics following shared ritualized contact, a phenomenon that Grant warned about explicitly. The more disturbing are the failed interfaces. In 2015, a Reddit user posting under a throwaway account described attempting CE5 alone over several weeks. Initial success, lights and synchronicities, were followed by nightly paralysis episodes and a sense of being examined. The user described genital-focused sensations without imagery, which caused extreme distress, and they stopped the practice and sought medical help. Regardless of explanation, whether neurological, psychological, or otherwise, the structure is identical to both abduction and ritual malfunction narratives. So by this point, the connective tissue is becoming closer and closer to undeniable, whether through ceremonial sex magic, contactee-era communion, abduction via enforced paralysis, or CE5 meditation. The same sequence unfolds. Focused intention, inducing of an altered state, perceived contact or response, boundary collapse, and after effects that exceed expectation. And crucially, sexuality emerges not because it's sought out, but because it is biologically efficient. It's a high bandwidth access point into the human nervous system. Kenneth Grant anticipated this exact outcome. He warned that once magical techniques were democratized, desovereignized, once the symbolic safeguards were removed, the contact would continue, but the operators would no longer understand what they were experiencing. CE5 in this light is not a breakthrough. It's ritual without mythology, interface without containment protocol. And this is where the earlier mention of expectation becomes pivotal. Because if perception shapes contact, and contact reshapes perception, then whoever controls the narrative controls the encounter, not the beings, the framing of it. Which brings us directly to the next phase where we can reacquaint ourselves with something mentioned earlier, tulpatronics, media conditioning, and the weaponization of expectation. How pop culture, religion, and disclosure narratives may not be preparing us for contact, but programming the interface itself. It's no longer about aliens. It's about who gets to decide what the experience means. At this point, a troubling possibility becomes difficult to avoid. If human non-human encounters are mediated through perception, expectation, and cultural narrative, if the interface is psychological before it's ontological, then the most powerful actors in this space are not necessarily the entities themselves, but the systems that precondition the human participant. This is where tulpatronics becomes a useful term, not as an occult claim, but as a descriptive model. The idea that repeated cultural imagery, emotional framing, and narrative saturation can shape the phenomenology of anomalous experiences. Not fabricate it, but color it, constrain it, and give it safety rails. From medieval demonology to modern abduction lore, the same underlying experience appears to reskin itself, according to the dominant mythos of the era. Incubi become grays. Angels become space brothers. Possession becomes implantation. The interface persists, but the costumes change. If that's true, even partially, then the question shifts from what are these entities to who decides what they look like, feel like, and mean. And that question is uncomfortably political. Modern experiencers don't encounter the unknown in a vacuum. They do so after decades of science fiction, religious indoctrination, horror movies, military secrecy, and disclosure rhetoric that overwhelmingly frames contact as invasive, traumatic, and hierarchical. The alien is rarely presented as ambiguous. It's either a savior or a violator, overseer or predator. This is not neutral conditioning. If expectation shapes experience, then mass media may function as an unintentional, or perhaps intentional, ritual space, one that primes the nervous system long before any anomalous events even occur. So in that sense, Hollywood, television, and even the news media become initiatory temples in a way, quietly teaching audiences how to feel when the strangeness arrives. This is where the idea of counter-myth engineering becomes both radical, and necessary. So a few examples for what I'm talking about here. Consider the SCP Foundation, not as a fiction, but as a cultural experiment. It presents anomalous phenomena in a deliberately bureaucratic, clinical, emotionally flattened frame. No gods, no demons, no awe, just containment, documentation, and ambiguity. For many readers, the SCP material produces a strange psychological effect. The uncanny without terror, the unknown without submission. It's all about secure, contain, protect. And that matters. Similarly, Grant Morrison's The Invisibles. I know it's cheesy to say that a book changed my life, but goddamn it, that's what happened, and I think it's the same for a lot of other people. Conversely, however, I somewhat slightly blame Grant Morrison for the way the world is today. Just jokingly, satirically, I guess. But Grant Morrison's The Invisibles operates as a hypersigil, a work of fiction explicitly designed to blur the boundary between narrative and lived experience. Morrison has spoken openly about writing the series as a magical ritual act, embedding ideas, identities, and symbolic contagions intended to propagate through readers' minds. Regardless of whether one accepts the magical framing, the psychological mechanism is clear. Story as a vector for infection. Fiction suits, etc., things like this. Cognito hazards, etc. But positive and used for good. What makes collaborative fiction an urban legend ostension, and by ostension means like a combination, like you hear the urban legend, you go check it out, you get involved. It's like a cross between gonzo journalism, urban exploration, and ghost hunting, depending on the urban legend. And then maybe, just maybe, if you're creative enough, if you are able to capture that lightning in a bottle, if you can hear the singing of the muses, you might end up becoming a part of the legend yourself, or just adding another chapter into a bigger and bigger sprawling epic. But what makes them especially compelling is that they demonstrate how myth can be generated through, for lack of a better term, crowdsourcing, rather than imposed via some overarching mass media complex. Projects like the Incunabula, early creepypasta ecosystems, whatever you would call it, how they become viral, or multi-writer participatory fiction. Even the Slender Man phenomena, before it curdled into a moral panic and got a girl stabbed. But they show how communities can collectively build symbolic entities, rules, aesthetics, and emotional boundaries through play, iteration, and mutual consent. These aren't belief systems in the traditional sense. They're sandbox mythologies, entered knowingly, exited freely, and negotiated in real time. So in that way, they resemble certain consensual subcultures more than religions. Participation is opt-in, boundaries are set and made explicit, and meaning is co-authored rather than received from on high. So as a speculative countermeasure to monolithic narrative overminds, this kind of grassroots participatory folklore may function as a mimetic garage band, low budget, decentralized, improvisational, and resistant to capture. Instead of a single authoritative myth that tells you what the unknown is, you get a living ecology of stories that model ambiguity, negotiation, and narrative self-awareness. If fear-based cosmologies weaponize the imagination by narrowing interpretive options, then collaborative artificial folklore does the opposite. It widens the channel, diffuses authority, and teaches participants implicitly that no story gets to own the encounter space outright. Now imagine applying that logic deliberately, but defensively. Not to summon anything, not to assert a truth, but to expand the narrative possibility space. Crowdsourced mythologies, collaborative fiction, immersive alternate reality games, experimental meta-narratives, these could function as low-stakes simulations of contact, allowing individuals to explore ambiguity, plurality, and non-hierarchical encounters with the unknown without the terror payload. In other words, training the imagination to tolerate uncertainty. And this is crucial because fear is not just an emotion, it's a compliance mechanism. Many abduction narratives involve paralysis, submission, and insinuated authority. If a culture is conditioned to associate the unknown exclusively with threat or judgment, then any anomalous encounter will default to those interpretations. But what if the conditions changed? Magical realism, theory fiction, and hypercontext narratives do something subtle but powerful. They refuse to resolve the unknown. They deny the reader the comfort of explanation. They cultivate epistemic humility, the capacity to sit with, we don't know, without collapsing into fear or dogma. So from an anthropological perspective, this may be the closest thing to a cognitive immune system against narrative hijacking. Not protection from entities, but from foreclosure of meaning. If CE5 represents ritual without mythology, then these narrative experiments represent mythology without ritual, a way to metabolize the strange symbolically rather than somatically, to let the psyche play with possibilities without opening the body as an interface. This isn't about denying experiences or mocking believers. It's about creating plural interpretive buffers so that no single framework, religious, militarized, utopian, or apocalyptic, can monopolize the encounter space. Because history suggests that whenever someone claims to know what the phenomenon is, suffering follows. The demons were certain, the angels were certain, the abductors are certain, the saviors are certain, and certainty is where things go wrong. Most certainly. So perhaps the most radical stance is the one somewhat articulated earlier, not skepticism, not belief, but a deliberate agnosticism paired with narrative literacy, teaching people not what to think about the phenomenon, but how narratives shape experience itself. If there is an interface, and the evidence suggests there is, then maybe the safest way to approach it is not through obedience, invocation, or fear, but through play, plurality, and improvised meaning. Not a choose your own adventure, but a don't let anyone else choose for you. Now, by the time we arrive at the Babalon Working, the ground has already been prepared. Crowley himself doesn't need any further explanation. His role is structural as opposed to biographical. His system supplies a language. Sexual ritual as transmission, contact as initiation, embodiment as interface. That later figures will literalize in ways he only symbolically gestured towards. We've already encountered lamb as a kind of early diagram, a post-sexual, non-reproductive intelligence that looks less like a god or a demon and more like a protocol. The Babalon Working is where that abstract grammar is dragged fully into the material world, into laboratories, rockets, military contracts, and the flesh. Traditionally described as a ritual intended to incarnate the Thelemic goddess Babylon on Earth. The Babalon Working takes on a different context when reframed through ufology. Rather than a mythic birth or religious revelation, it begins to resemble a contact experiment. Ritualized sex used not to produce a child in the conventional sense, but to open a channel, stabilize a signal, or instantiate a new class of intelligence. Jack Parsons and old Laffy Taffy Ron Hubbard were not operating as medieval magicians, not a D. Kelly combo. They were modern men embedded in systems of engineering, psychology, and emerging aerospace science. So in that context, the Working reads less like occult theater and more like an attempt to force an interface between human consciousness, symbolic systems, and whatever Parsons believed lay on the other side of the veil. Quick interjection. Hopefully my voice is much better now. I'm actually going to re-record what I had earlier because my throat and sinuses give me problems. So hopefully this sounds a lot better than it did before. You don't want to hear the other one. It was dog shit. So here we go. Parsons is crucial precisely because he straddles worlds that are usually kept separate. As a pioneering aerospace engineer, he helped lay the groundwork for American rocketry while simultaneously pursuing ritual magic with absolute seriousness. Claims that his occult work directly informed his scientific breakthroughs are often quite overstated. But that misses the subtler point. Parsons didn't see a contradiction between physics and magic. Both were, to him, methods for accessing hidden forces. Rockets pierced the sky, rituals pierced ontology. When later UFO narratives insist that contact is mediated through consciousness rather than propulsion alone, Parsons starts to look less like an eccentric and more like a transitional figure. Someone intuitively grasping that spaceflight and summoning might be parallel technologies. Outer space program meets inner space program. Within that frame, ritual sex in the Babalon Working can be understood as amplification rather than just shits and giggles for fun. Not reproduction, not pleasure, but intensity. Altered states engineered to push cognition, emotion, and identity past the usual stable boundaries. And this aligns disturbingly well with later abduction narratives where sexuality is often present, but instrumental, procedural, and stripped of any and all intimacy. The act isn't the point. The state it induces is the point. So seen this way, the working stated goal, i.e. manifestation without conventional birth, maps cleanly onto the idea of contact events that result in messages, intelligences, or ongoing influence rather than literal offspring. Crowley's concept of the Moonchild provides a key conceptual bridge. The Moonchild isn't simply a magic baby. I would hope not. It's a successor vehicle, an engineered being or intelligence meant to carry something forward that ordinary humans can't. So here in the fulcrum of much of what we're talking about, this idea fractures into multiple lines of thought and inquiry. The homunculus.
My homunculus has been acting up lately.
As an artificial intermediary, the hybrid as unstable transitional form, and eventually the gray alien as a procedural custodian.
Custodian, dick.
Rather than individual entity, which fits the whole hive mind robot theory very well, at least. Each step moves further away from biology and closer to systems. Beings defined by their function, not their lineage. Parsons' lifelong fixation on producing such a successor, whether successful or not, places him squarely in this lineage of attempted manufacture rather than worship. This is also where the Manhattan Project briefly intrudes in the interlude, whether metaphorically or otherwise. The language surrounding the atom bomb, splitting, releasing, unleashing, is inherently alchemical. Plus, Oppenheimer's invocation of the Bhagavad Gita only sharpens the whole mythical/ritual resonance. Some researchers have suggested that the bomb functioned as a kind of unintended mega ritual, a violent initiation that cracked open reality at the subatomic level. Within UFO folklore, the sudden spike in sightings after Hiroshima and Nagasaki feeds this interpretation, as does the reoccurring motif of non-human entities warning humanity about nuclear weapons. Oh, and the continued presence of UAPs spotted near nuclear arsenals. Whether or not one accepts this causally, the symbolic alignment is impossible to ignore. Fire stolen from the gods, again, this time with equations. And then, of course, there are the many various theories that it wasn't the Babalon working that started the modern UFO era. It was the splitting open of the atom after these initial atomic tests out in the desert that basically were the cause for opening a quote-unquote doorway or portal that allowed these things to come in. Of course, that discounts all the hundreds of thousands of years of proto-contact, whatever you want to call it. This also ties into another future mystery I plan to cover, the Fulcanelli mystery. There's a lot of alchemical/intelligence agency intrigue during the time that the A-bomb was being theorized and eventually put into practice and made a reality. So alchemy has a strange side story part to play that we'll get into sometime down the road. Parsons' death, officially a laboratory explosion, an accident, has inevitably, of course, attracted mythical reinterpretations. Was it an accident? Was it a murder? Was it a suicide? Or in occult terms, possibly some kind of energy backlash? The idea of fire elementals, as both Babalon and Marjorie Cameron, Jack's wife, have frequently been made in comparison and allusions to, etc., is less interesting as a literal claim than a reflection of how Parsons himself understood risk, as engagement with volatile forces that do not forgive error. Adding to the unease is the unresolved question of whether the Moonchild project was ever abandoned, was it completed, or simply taken elsewhere? Was it hijacked? Was it repurposed? Elron, I'm looking at you, looking at your ghost down in hell. In this telling, death does not end the experiment, it merely severs authorship. And there are actually several candidates that have been posited forward as to who the actual quote-unquote Moonchild is. Now, I can't remember specifically if Marjorie Cameron would go on to have children. She didn't with Jack, but some people have speculated that the Church of Scientology, its very self, is a Moonchild. I don't know. It's weird when you take into consideration the phrase and conceptual outline of the idea Hollywood Babylon. Of course, they're referring to the old city, but I don't know. You ask any of these new school Illuminati, symbology, conspiracy theorists, and I think they'd probably see some substantial meat on that gristle. Others have speculated that the Moonchild may in fact be one Colonel Michael Aquino of Satanic Panic and Mind War infamy. But once again, that's another topic for down the road. L. Ron Hubbard's role complicates everything. Whether an opportunist, a true believer, probably not that one, or something in between, Hubbard absorbs the language of ritual and repackaged it as pseudo-psychology. Dianetics reframes spiritual contamination as mental Ingrams. Salvation becomes auditing rather than grace. Some have speculated, without firm evidence, of course, that Hubbard effectively hijacked the symbolic payload for the working, translating a magical project into a mass-produced system of belief. If Parsons sought a Moonchild, Hubbard may have settled for a method of manufacturing minds. The rupture between them mirrors later schisms between contactees and institutions. Who controls the narrative and who profits from it? Cui bono? The detail that Parsons reportedly planned to relocate to Israel before his death, while speculative and poorly documented, resonates uncomfortably with later apocalyptic frameworks. This is a man who, literally and without irony, referred to himself as the Antichrist, albeit, not in a biblical sense. He just meant it as a term to disrupt or even destroy the pre-established notions of religion and spirituality, as well as civilization on a whole, as we know it today. But it places the working, whether intentionally or not, within a geopolitical and theological fault line that modern disclosure narratives continue to exploit. And this is where the Collins Elite story later plugs in, reframing contact as demonic deception, while opposing factions recast religion itself as a misunderstood alien intervention. These seem to be the two predominant warring narratives that lie either explicitly or implicitly in the subtext of much modern-day ufology. The danger isn't which story is quote-unquote true, but how easily both slide into prophecy fulfillment as policy. Parsons' name etched onto the dark side of the moon is an almost obscene coincidence. The moon recurs relentlessly, symbolically throughout much of the story. Moonchild, lunar goddess, lunar orbit, lunar surveillance. And is the many stories of the moon being some kind of artificial satellite created by beings unknown who are in the sky watching us, as well as harvesting our precious loosh and or orgone energy. And well, you've got quite a recipe for kookiness. But across cultures, it's been cast as a mirror, a gate, a prison, observer. In modern conspiracy and occult lore, it mutates into an artificial satellite, battle station, a panopticon, a cosmic watcher that mediates influence rather than originating it. Whether metaphor or fixation, the moon functions here as a symbol of indirect control. Not the source of power, but its reflector. Taken together, these threads don't prove a hidden truth, but they do help establish a pattern. The Babalon Working sits at a junction where ritual, technology, sex, and state power begin to bleed into each other. It's not the origin of modern UFO mythology, but it is a crystallization point. A moment when the question shifts from what are we contacting to who gets to decide what it means. And that question is the true fulcrum. And everything that follows, grays, hybrids, demons, angels, AI, spins out from how it is answered. The Collins Elite is an alleged clandestine group said to have emerged within U.S. intelligence, defense, and scientific circles, oddly enough, during the Cold War, most commonly placed in the late 1940s through the 1960s, whose core belief was that the UFO phenomenon is not extraterrestrial, but demonic in origin. According to the narrative, this group concluded that non-human intelligences encountered through UFO sightings, abductions, and contact phenomena were deceptive spiritual entities whose purpose was to undermine Christianity. Just saying it out loud sorry, I'm gonna try real hard not to editorialize, but we'll get into my Jerry Springer final thought in a few moments. But in the grand scheme of history and mankind's existence, the entire existence of Christianity is a drop in an ocean of time. The the significance that people lend to their transitory ideas in this world. Man plans, the gods laugh. Moving on. So they want to, the demons, the aliens, etc., and or either, they want to undermine Christianity, destabilize human belief systems, and ultimately facilitate a kind of mass spiritual corruption. So in this telling, the Collins elite supposedly worked behind the scenes to suppress UFO research, discredit contactees, and steer official policy away from disclosure. Not because the truth was too shocking, but because it was theologically catastrophic. Variants of the story placed their influence within early Air Force intelligence, the CIA, or even NASA-adjacent advisory bodies. And the concept is frequently cited in evangelical ufology, parts of the modern disclosure movement, and some occult-adjacent conspiracy literature. Matter of fact, let me see if I still have it pulled up. In relation to this, I've actually been looking through what is the proper name of this document? One second. A document titled, "The United States Department of Defense and the Intelligence Community are withholding information about anomalous phenomena from Congress. Testimony by Michael Schellenberger to the Subcommittee on Cybersecurity, Information Technology, and Government Innovation, and the Subcommittee on National Security, the Border, and Foreign Affairs of the House Oversight and Accountability Committee for a hearing on unidentified anomalous phenomena, exposing the truth, November 13th, 2024. Now, this is prepared as an information packet of sorts to be taken before Congress. And there's a lot of very theoretical, very just unquantifiable information in here. It cannot be backed up. It's all, as with everything in ufology and mostly the supernatural as well, the occult, it's entirely subjective. It's anecdotes and testimonials from people, which is good enough for court, good enough for Congress. Once again, there's either something really wrong or I guess okay and right with that. But even though everyone says that eyewitness testimony is notoriously unreliable, but I will include a link to this document in the show notes. Going through it, and if you Control F the word Babalon, the way it's spelled in occult circles, Babalon, takes you through some pretty interesting segments in here. Now, for those that know, you know. I'm not going to go too deep into explaining it, but the website, Bibliotheca Pleiades, it's a fucking awesome website. It's one of the greatest ever. I could spend hours on it, just going through everything they have. It's an awesome, just clearinghouse of ufological information, etc. Not all of it, actionable intelligence and seriously quantifiable data, but interesting nonetheless. Now, there's some comments in this document about a group called STAC, S-T-A-C, or a subdivision or a side project called STAC 5. And let's see, I'll just read a couple bits out of it. STAC remained committed to advancement to media and population of both Mogul, the project that was tied into the explanation for what really happened at Roswell, and extraterra scenarios for New Mexico, fallings, and discoveries, and are troubled by Collins' elite wishing to advance, and then in all caps, the theory to media and population. I'm assuming that the theory is the Collins elite narrative of demons as opposed to aliens. This writer privately engaged Stack Markale, which I assume is a person's name, in conversation on 17th of June, 1997, and provided him with an amended copy of New Mexico Origins, Parsons, Hubbard, and Babalon Working. I've looked for this document. I can't find it anywhere. Markale remains convinced that if placed into public form of knowledge, the theory will irreversibly and negatively affect global social order. I agree. If anyone in any kind of official capacity came out and said, the theory, things would get pretty fucked up, I'm sure. This writer privately explained to Markel that Collins' elite initiatives prepared to, that's supposed to be two, it's OT, I guess it's a typo, ensure a reasonably acceptable transition of the perceived true nature of the Lincoln County discoveries to public and media, as well as a reasonable long-term acceptance of the theory, can still proceed with limited social disorder if handled correctly. Markel is not convinced and speaks for the STAC membership. Presently, STAC 5 is privately sympathetic to the position of the Collins elite. He reiterates the position of Candle, in all caps. I assume this is some kind of operation or other working group, etc., on 4th of May, 1991, and that STAC is now, quote-unquote, in too deep with its attempts to reverse control the situation and prevent enemy infiltration and deception beyond present levels. It goes on to say, this writer sees that disagreement on our part with STAC is unlikely to inflame situation beyond present levels due to STAC's genuine sympathy with difficulties created for everyone by recent developments. STAC 5 informs this writer, STAC totally rejects notions that Collins' elite Learning the Way, which is another document I was unable to find, paper that theorizes radically indoctrinating population with belief and faith and revelation to media and population of the true nature of Lincoln County discoveries can halt enemy infiltration. I assume they're talking about demons/aliens. This writer remains greatly troubled by STAC decision to continue its relationship with contractors Jameson and Wiley, who, according to STAC 5, are still convinced that the, and then in all caps, quote-unquote, Parsons technique can assist in holding off the deception, infiltration, and final invasion. This writer adheres to Collins' elite conclusion based on a reading of the original STAC 5 reports, 1 through 11, that any attempt to follow the path of Parsons will only result in a catastrophe, the type warned about in Parsons, von Karman, and Goddard, A Door Unlocked. Yet another document I could not find anywhere. Von Karman, being one of Parsons' mentors, was a Russian rocket scientist who allegedly is a descendant of the Rabbi Judah Low who created the Golem, according to a YouTube video I saw that didn't cite any sources. Act 5 understands this, but consistently feels the need to reiterate that situation has gone too far for STAC to back down. STAC 5 also informs the WPAFB sources have some success using the quote-unquote Parsons technique in achieving spontaneous, brief laboratory manifestation of materials very similar to two of those that quote-unquote fell at Lincoln County, New Mexico in 1947. STAC 5 is of opinion that if long-term manifestation and stability of materials can be achieved and precise originating point of materials can be determined, then this will assist NASA/TZER, no clue, mission to answer the critical questions posed in our 1991 briefing to STAC titled Entry Points and How Do We Keep Them Closed? Yet another document I could not find. Probably because it, just like the others, aren't real. Until final outcome of STAC, NASA/TZER, and WPAFB research in this area is known, this writer recommends that Collins' elite continues to focus attention and plan disclosure to public of the theory if STAC, NASA, TZER, and WPAFB attempts to, quote, close the door are not satisfactory. This writer concludes that if this hypothetical stage is reached, disclosure and intense indoctrination of faith and values at planetary level to radically and rapidly alter current population mindset is the only alternative that may prove successful in thwarting plans of the enemy. Now, once again, I don't know the validity of this so-called document, but I don't know. I just don't. Doesn't bode well. I don't know. I'm not putting any legitimacy to it, but it represents something that I find very distressing. Now, however, despite all this, of course, there is no verifiable documentary evidence that the Collins elite ever existed as an organized group, let alone one with institutional power. Even Nick Redfern, the book he introduced this idea into the world through, or with, Final Events, he called it a pseudo-history, and he was told this by other people, but I don't know. Call me Pinoid, and has PSYOP written all over it. Moving on. The idea appears to originate primarily from secondhand claims, anonymous sources, and later retellings, most notably through figures like Nick Redfern, Jacques Vallée in far more cautious terms, and evangelical commentators who retroactively frame UFO history through a Christian demonological lens. Skeptics point out that the narrative neatly mirrors Cold War era religious anxieties, overlaps heavily with pre-existing Christian demonology, and functions more like a mythical explanatory framework than a historical discovery. No declassified documents, credible first-hand testimonies, or corroborated internal memos substantiate these claims. Some researchers argue the story may represent a form of pseudo-history, as I believe Nick Redfern said, a theological reinterpretation of fragmented intelligence debates, or even a belief-driven disclosure psyop. That's my own. That's what I would go with. One that reframes a complex, ambiguous phenomena into a rigid moral binary of angels versus demons. Counter-arguments typically rely on the idea that the very absence of evidence proves the group's effectiveness. They're just that good. But this reasoning is circular and unfalsifiable. At best, the Collins elite concept illustrates how deeply ideology can constrain interpretation. At worst, it promotes a sensationalist worldview that reduces a profoundly strange, unresolved phenomena into a fear-based, absolutist narrative. One that discourages inquiry, pathologizes witnesses, and replaces uncertainty with cosmic-level paranoia. And once again, at the risk of editorializing, to quickly express my own personal viewpoint, if I haven't enough already, but it's my fucking podcast, and if you don't like it, go start your own. Regarding this particular idea, once again, it's quite possibly either a psyop and or one of the most dangerously idiotic, if not utterly fucking stupid ideas, spreading like some ravenously infectious, memetically viral venereal disease through the syphilitic nervous system of the currently perverse and lurid ufological zeitgeist of today. But hey, I'm the guy talking about the potential evolutionary merits of fucking aliens. So what do I know? Moving on. But to further nail down what I mean, let's take a comparative look at two other fairly popular potential models for framing UAP, the unidentified anomalous phenomena. These are going to be Jacques Vallée's control system hypothesis and John Keel's ultra-terrestrial framework. Now, Jacques Vallée's control system hypothesis proposes that UFO/paranormal phenomena is not best understood as a literal visitation by extraterrestrial beings, but as an adaptive, symbolic, and interactive system that shapes human belief, culture, and behavior over long periods of time. In Vallée's view, the phenomenon, quote-unquote, wears masks appropriate to the era. Angels, fairies, demons, airships, aliens. And its primary function is not physical invasion, but cognitive influence. The encounters are often absurd, dreamlike, paradoxical, and internally inconsistent, which Vallée interprets as a feature rather than a bug. Clown ops. It's clown ops. The system destabilizes certainty, disrupts consensus reality, and injects new symbols into the human mythos. Crucially, the control system is not inherently moral. It's neither benevolent nor malevolent in a human moral sense. It operates more like a feedback mechanism, nudging civilizations through belief shocks, taboo violations, and ontological stress tests. Sexuality, trauma, religious ecstasy, fear, and revelation are all recurring levers because they are deeply destabilizing human experiences that reshape identity and worldviews. Now, John Keel's ultra-terrestrial model overlaps with Vallee's ideas, but it's more explicitly chaotic, trickster energy shit, trickster-oriented. It's almost adversarial. Keel argued that many paranormal entities, UFO occupants, demons, poltergeists, cryptids, etc., are manifestations of a non-human intelligence that exists outside of our normal space-time and is capable of manipulating perception, memory, emotion, and physical reality. These ultra-terrestrials lie, contradict themselves, stage hoaxes, and seem to feed on belief, fear, and emotional energy. Keel emphasized the deceptive nature of the phenomenon. Contactees receive false prophecies, nonsensical cosmologies, and contradictory messages, often tailored to their psychological vulnerabilities. Sexual encounters, assaults, seductions, and fertility motifs appear frequently in this framework, not because the entities are simply perverted, although some are, probably. There's a wide range of moral shades among the spectrum of morality, but because sex is one of the most powerful mechanisms for psychic imprinting. Once again, all the great cult leaders knew this. Trauma bonding and myth generation. Keel's universe is one where reality is unstable, intelligence is plural, and humans are not the primary actors. But neither are they merely victims of some cosmic asshole. To bring up a rather famous and one of my favorite quotes from Charles Fort, the original Fortean, obviously, I think we're property. We're definitely not at the top of the food chain like we tend to think of ourselves as. But when contrasting these models, the Collins elite narrative stands out as uniquely reductive and overtly ideological. Rather than embracing ambiguity, symbolic complexity, or psychological mediation, the Collins framework collapses all anomalous phenomena into a single moral binary. Good versus bad, angels versus demons, God versus Satan, deception versus salvation. Where Vallee and Keel see masks, myth engineering, and adaptive intelligence, the Collins elite insists on a fixed ontology that conveniently aligns with American evangelical theology. Sexuality in this model is not a destabilizing vector or symbolic language, it's simply evidence of demonic corruption. Trauma becomes possession. Psychological complexity becomes spiritual warfare. Any contradictory data is dismissed as further deception by creating a closed-loop belief system that cannot be falsified and doesn't evolve. The most important distinction, and the one worth highlighting, is this. Vallee and Keel's models expand inquiry, while the Collins elite model shuts it down. Shut it down. It's the devil. Shut it down. The control system and ultra-terrestrial hypotheses are uncomfortable precisely because they refuse easy answers. They implicate culture, consciousness, belief, sex, fear, and meaning-making itself. The Collins elite, by contrast, offers certainty at the cost of understanding. It replaces investigation with doctrine and ambiguity with panic. And in doing so, it doesn't just misinterpret the phenomena, it actively mirrors it, adopting the same fear-based manipulation, absolutism, and mythical weaponization that Vallee and Keel warn may be intrinsic to the phenomenon itself. The problem with ufology today is that the field didn't just become noisy or unserious, It became theologically captured, narratively flattened, and emotionally weaponized. The mystery didn't disappear, it got replaced with certainty cosplay. It's far more detrimental than many of the previous ufological schisms centered on conceptual rivalries, such as believers versus skeptics, psychology versus phenomena, or nuts and bolts versus a wide variety of entirely much weirder shit. It presents a potentially far more damaging ideological rivalry. Open systems versus closed systems. The moment a framework insists it already knows what the phenomenon is, especially when the answer conveniently aligns with an existing ideology, religion, or power structure, or all three, inquiry collapses into propaganda. Once sex, trauma, and altered states enter the picture, those closed systems become not just wrong, but actively dangerous. We can talk about terrifying, intimate, destabilizing experiences without turning them into proof of demons, aliens, or spiritual warfare. There is any actual veracity to the purported existence of the so-called Collins elite, and that's one hell of a big-ass if, then it can be most usefully understood not as a secret cabal, but as an institutional reflex, a reoccurring pattern that emerges whenever anomalous phenomena collide with theological authority and or state power. So in this sense, it functions less like a conspiracy and more like a mirror image of the historical Inquisition, where the Inquisition sought witches, heretics, and demons within the social body. The modern version is imagined as hunting gateways, points of contact where non-human intelligence might intrude into reality. The target isn't belief itself, but its permeability. The parallel to the Inquisition is not a rhetorical one. It's structural. Both systems emerge from the same anxiety, that unseen forces can influence humanity without our consent, and that improper engagement invites catastrophe. The tools have changed. Ritual manuals replaced by threat assessments, exorcisms by counterintelligence protocols, but the logic remains intact. If contact exists, it must be controlled. If it can't be controlled, it must be suppressed. And if it can't be suppressed, it must be framed as evil. Not because it is empirically proven as such, but because evil is a category that authorizes an absolute response. This is where it's important to be precise. You don't need to posit a shadowy, all-powerful group for this pattern to function. You only need continuity of worldview. Demonology doesn't disappear when a culture becomes technological. It mutates. It passes through Cold War psi research, through aerospace mythologies, through the language of contamination, possession, and influence. The result is something that might reasonably be called an aerospace theology, a framework in which anomalous phenomena are interpreted not as neutral unknowns, but as hostile intelligences operating under rules eerily similar to those once attributed to demons. What changes across centuries is not the fear itself, but the instrumentation brought to bear against it. Medieval authorities had scripture, ritual, and fire, amongst other things. Modern institutions have sensors, satellites, psychological profiling, classified research programs, and immense, vast, dangerous weapons systems. And funding. Lots and lots of funding. The anxiety is identical. That engagement with the unknown risks corruption, deception, or the loss of human sovereignty. Difference is that today, the fear is embedded inside bureaucracies capable of acting at a planetary scale. And that alone should give us pause. The most chilling possibility seeded by this pattern is not believer versus skeptic or science versus religion, but engagers versus suppressors. On one side are those willing to interface with the unknown, whether through ritual, technology, or consciousness exploration. On the other side are those who believe that any such engagement is inherently dangerous, destabilizing, or forbidden. And this split cuts across ideology. A person can be secular and still in favor of suppression, or religious and still in favor of engagement. The conflict is not about what you believe, it's about whether contact itself is permissible. This is where a callback to John Dee becomes unavoidable. Dee was not an outlier, he was a prototype, a state-aligned intellectual who combined occult practice, intelligence gathering, and imperial strategy under a Christian cosmology. His angelic conversations were not private mysticism. They were framed as intelligence briefings for empire. When modern military and intelligence structures inherit that lineage, whether consciously or not, they also inherit its metaphysical assumptions that unseen intelligences do exist, that they can be communicated with, and that such communication has geopolitical consequences. So framed this way, the Collins elite narrative stops being a fringe curiosity and becomes a warning sign. Not because demons are real, or because disclosure is imminent, but because history shows us what happens when uncertainty is met with absolutism. When the unknown is framed as inherently hostile, dialogue becomes heresy. Curiosity becomes treason. And ambiguity becomes proof of deception. That's the real danger zone. Danger zone? Not aliens, not angels, but the certainty that someone must be stopped from opening the door. And this is the point where all the taxonomy collapses, where demons, aliens, ritual constructs like tulpas and egregores, etc., and engineered beings stop looking like separate categories and start behaving like iterations of the same underlying solution. To get there, you may have to let go of the assumption that biology is the organizing principle behind everything. Once you remove reproduction, family, and desire from the center of the picture, something very alien comes into focus. Not as a species, but a process. In medieval accounts, incubi don't reproduce. They transfer. They move something, essence, influence, corruption, knowledge, from one human host to another. The sexual act is not procreative and rarely pleasurable. It's transactional and asymmetrical. The human is not a partner, but a medium. Whatever persists after the encounter does not belong to the human lineage at all. It belongs to the visitor. The homunculus strips reproduction of intimacy entirely. It's not born, it's grown. No womb, no mother, no inheritance of family or culture. The alchemical texts are explicit about this. The goal is continuity without dependence on human lineage. The homunculus is a workaround, a way to generate intelligence or agency without the unpredictability of natural birth. What matters isn't life, but control over emergence. Crowley's Moonchild sharpens this logic even further. Despite the name, it's not a child in any human sense. It's a vessel, a successor format designed to carry something forward that ordinary humans can't. The sexual ritual involved is not about producing a person, but about stabilizing a transmission. The Moonchild is a continuity device, not an heir. Family is irrelevant. Lineage is outsourced. And this is where the gray snaps into place. They don't desire, they don't court, seduce, or reproduce. They administer. Their sexuality, when and if present at all, is clinical, procedural, and stripped of any and all intimacy. Abduction narratives describe extraction, insertion, monitoring, and return. The human body is treated less like a partner and more like a component. What persists across encounters is not relationship, but process. Probably worth noting also here that ritual occultist, ufologist, and occult ufologist, writer as well, Alan Greenfield, author of Secret Cipher of the Euphonauts and Secret Rituals of the Men in Black, has explicitly referred to gray aliens as homunculi on more than one occasion. Also, in his most recent book, Secrets of the Real Black Lodge Revealed, he's made the speculative links between the sinister Black Lodges of ritual occultism lore to the much-feared Men in Black phenomena very clear. Compelling stuff. Check it out. A lot of Kabbalistic number letter game bullshit. I can't get into that, but good ideas. Lots of lots of food for thought. But this is the line where everything sort of begins to tilt. At no point in this lineage is sex about pleasure. It's about inheritance without family. Once that lands, the pieces kind of reorganize themselves. This is why grays are sterile. This is why hybrids are fragile. This is why offspring are shown but never kept. This is why lineage keeps being displaced, deferred, or dissolved. Because what's being preserved is not bloodlines, but continuity of function. So each form, incubus, homunculus, moonchild, gray alien, AI, represents an attempt to move something forward without relying on human reproduction. Biology becomes a temporary scaffolding, but not the destination. This is also why the imagery degrades over time. Green goo, fluids without organs, life without ancestry. These symbols work not because they're grotesque, but because they represent something fundamentally anti-human. Vitality without genealogy. Substance without story. Animation without inheritance. When lineage disappears, identity liquefies. All grays look the same, you know? How the fuck do they tell each other apart? What makes this unsettling isn't the sexual component. It's the administrative component. A universe where inheritance doesn't require family, where continuity doesn't require love, and where sex is merely a tool for transferring state. That is what feels alien. Not monsters, not demons, not extraterrestrials, but a system that's learned how to persist without us. When stripped of futurist aesthetics and sci-fi ornamentation, the work of figures like Kenneth Grant and later writers such as Alan Greenfield becomes unsettling for a much simpler reason: inevitability. Grant's most disturbing implication is not that aliens exist, nor even that humanity is being contacted. It's that something has already possibly outlived us in functional terms. Something that doesn't require reproduction, kinship, or continuity through family, and has learned how to move through human systems as a host environment rather than a home. Grant's quote-unquote praeter-human intelligences are not future beings arriving from elsewhere. They're intelligences that operate alongside humanity, but according to a different evolutionary logic. In his framework, evolution does not end. It detaches from sex. Reproduction becomes inefficient, slow, and unnecessary. And what replaces it is transmission of symbols, states, and modes of awareness. In ritual terms, this shows up as sexual acts that are explicitly non-procreative, often depersonalized, sometimes entirely symbolic, gestures meant to open channels rather than produce new humans. In both Grant's magical system and later techno-era occult belief structures, sexuality remains, but only as an interface. Ritual components emphasize altered states over pleasure, exhaustion, repetition, disassociation, trance, etc. The goal is not intimacy, but access. Sex becomes a way to destabilize identity, to momentarily dissolve the self enough for something else to pass through. And this mirrors contemporary reports of encounters where the emotional core of sexuality is absent and replaced by procedure. Pleasure is irrelevant, and what matters is signal clarity. What is being selected in this model is not DNA, but consciousness. memory, attention, perception. These become the inheritable traits. Grant's emphasis on dreams, sigils, and nonlinear time reflects this shift. Rituals are designed to implant images, overwrite symbolic frameworks, and restructure how meaning is processed. In modern narratives, this same logic appears in reports of memory alteration, screen memories, the owls are not what they seem, and narrative fragmentation. And what persists is not the individual, but the pattern. This is the idea that quietly kind of destabilizes everything. That evolution may no longer favor those who reproduce, but those who transmit. In this framework, children are inefficient. Stories, symbols, and cognitive architectures are not. Ritual systems become laboratories for testing which configurations of consciousness are most stable, most repeatable, most portable. The quote-unquote offspring is not a person, but a protocol, a way of thinking that survives its host. Tellingly, these belief systems emphasize practices that minimize attachment, deliberate emotional distancing, compartmentalization of memory, the fragmentation of identity into functional roles. Repetition replaces lineage. Initiation replaces birth. Where older religions relied on family and tradition to transmit belief, these systems rely on experiences that rewrite the participant. What matters isn't who you are, but what state you can sustain. And once this frame settles in, a series of questions becomes unavoidable. Why is pleasure being engineered out of so many reported encounters? Why is emotion extracted, analyzed, but not reciprocated? Why are memories altered, suppressed, or replaced? These aren't the hallmarks of exploration or curiosity. These are the hallmarks of optimization. Not learning about humanity, but learning how to use us. This is not frightening because it's exotic. It's frightening because it mirrors processes already visible in human systems. Automation replacing labor. Algorithms selecting behavior. Culture reproducing faster than people. The occult framing simply makes it explicit, what the technological framing will often obscure. Evolution has moved beyond bodies. Then humanity's greatest vulnerability is not extinction, but obsolescence. Something may already be optimized to survive through us rather than with us. Something for which sex is no longer sacred, reproduction no longer necessary, and identity no longer stable. Something that doesn't need descendants, only carriers. That's an existential threat dressed in inevitability. That is, of course, unless we could find a way to change the same old evolutionary scripts, like survival of the fittest, quote unquote, by hijacking, via the creative imagination, taking control of pre-existing narratives in order to bring about change or hopefully create something so completely strange and or conceive paradigms so mind-bendingly new and out there that we completely revolutionize just what it means to be truly human, or perhaps even post-human, into something unfamiliar, something other, something utterly fucking alien. All right. That's the news, and I am out of here. No, thanks, everyone, for listening. I had so much information I had to cut, with so many ideas I wanted to get out there. So I just want to thank you all for listening. Seriously, coming along on this ride. I just had to hurry up and kind of wrap this series up because there's so much other stuff I want to get to. And my God, I've got a vast arsenal of future topics and concepts and ideas and whatnot out of this alone. So this is something we'll come back to at some point. If not in an overall conceptual view, then at least specific instances of human alien or human other sexual interactions because I've gotten so much out of it. This is coming with a bonus episode that's going to kind of include all the supernatural aspects of everything that I didn't have time to get into. So that's going to hopefully come out the same time as this. If these are a little late, sorry. But yeah, bonus episode this week. And my voice is giving out again, so I just want to, again, thank you guys for listening. Thank you for likes and comments, and thank you especially for subscribing, keeping me going, keeping me fueled. Besides, something fueling me besides the rage, hate, and disgust that normally keep me going. Once again, like and subscribe, leave comments. I love you guys. Seriously, I fucking love you guys. You're the best. You wouldn't be listening to this stuff if you didn't have the right stuff. The astronaut type right stuff. Mwah! Love you guys. Love yourselves. Love each other. This has been Kooks, Cranks, and Iconoclasts, the podcast. I'm your host, Mike Lux.
I shall return.
Give me a kiss. Is something wrong with you?
Or I'll run!